Hey guys, tonight we're going to pull back the heavy, musty curtain on a corner of medieval life that frankly sounds like it was designed specifically not to keep you awake. We're talking about pilgrims. Yes, those dusty, weary travelers you vaguely remember from history class, trudging along muddy roads, maybe singing a hymn, probably smelling a bit ripe. Picture yourself there for a moment. The chill air nips at your face even through the coarse wool of your cloak. The road beneath your rough-hewn shoes is less a road and more a well-worn track of packed earth, stones, and yesterday's rain. There are no streetlights here, no convenient rest stops with questionable coffee and lukewarm pastries. It's just you, the vast, often intimidating landscape, and the distant, tantalizing promise of something holy at the end of your journey. You might be walking for weeks, months, maybe even years, facing bandits, bad weather, worse food, and the constant nagging ache in your feet. It was, shall we say, not the most luxurious vacation package. In fact, let's be honest, statistically, you probably wouldn't survive the round trip today without a serious upgrade to your medieval travel insurance, which, by the way, didn't exist. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is. It's wild to think about people listening to this little history sleepy time story all over the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You exist in a world where faith isn't just a Sunday morning activity or a quiet personal belief. It's the very air you breathe, the framework of your understanding. The dominant force in your daily existence from the moment you wake, usually with the chickens, until you collapse onto your straw mattress. The rhythms of life are dictated by the church calendar, the local priest holds significant sway, and the invisible realm of saints, angels, and the divine feels incredibly close, almost tangible. Miracles aren't just stories from a book. They are expected occurrences, possibilities woven into the fabric of reality. And in this world, certain objects hold immense power, fragments of that tangible divine, holy relics. These weren't just old bits and bobs. They were pieces of the true cross, bones of martyrs, scraps of saints' clothing, items touched by the divine figures themselves. They were, in the medieval mindset, direct conduits to the sacred, sources of healing, protection, and spiritual merit. Possessing a significant relic could transform a humble church into a magnet for pilgrims, a regional town into a bustling center of devotion and commerce. Kings sought them, bishops guarded them fiercely, and ordinary people traveled incredible distances, enduring unimaginable hardships, just to stand in their presence, to touch the reliquary, the fancy box holding the relic, to pray nearby, hoping for a blessing, a cure, or forgiveness for their sins. The sheer physical effort you'd expend, walking for hundreds or thousands of miles, sleeping rough, facing the elements, navigating unfamiliar lands with only faith and perhaps a few fellow travelers for company, speaks volumes about the power these objects held over the medieval imagination. It wasn't a casual decision, this pilgrimage business. It was often a life-altering, sometimes life-ending, undertaking. You understand implicitly that these relics aren't just inert objects. They are active. They do those things. They cure illnesses, sometimes supposedly. They protect from harm, allegedly. They offer glimpses of the divine. But what if they said things? What if amidst the hushed reverence of the reliquary chapel, the murmurs of prayer and the shuffle of tired feet, you thought you heard something else? A whisper, perhaps? Or something more unsettling? The history books tend to focus on the grand narratives, the famous saints, the major pilgrimage routes like the Camino de Santiago, or the journeys to Rome and Jerusalem, the impressive cathedrals built to house these treasures. And yes, those are absolutely central to understanding medieval pilgrimage. That's your mainstream historical fact for this section. Major pilgrimage routes like the Camino de Santiago were well-established networks facilitating travel across Europe for centuries, driven by the desire to venerate relics at destinations like Santiago de Compostela. They were, in essence, the medieval superhighways of faith, albeit very, very slow ones. But peel back another layer, beyond the official pronouncements and the impressive architecture, and you find stranger, more localized beliefs, accounts that sometimes skirt the edge of official doctrine or drift into folklore. You encounter whispers, tales exchanged by firelight in a crowded pilgrim hostel, stories passed down in a small village that just happens to possess a venerated local saint's pinky finger, or perhaps a feather shed by an angel. Yes, seriously, relics got weird. And among these more fringe tidbits, tucked away in lesser-known accounts or local legends, you find the truly peculiar. You find the idea, the unsettling notion, that sometimes, just sometimes, these holy objects made noises. Not just rustling cloth or the creak of a wooden reliquary. That's easily explained. We're talking about sounds that seemed sentient. Sounds that people interpreted as meaningful, perhaps even miraculous, but also potentially deeply unnerving. Imagine kneeling before a venerated bone fragment, expecting a wave of peace or a sense of divine presence, and instead you perceive a cry, a groan, a sound that feels like it's emanating from the relic itself. It's one of those historical details that makes you pause and think, wait, what? It's important to remember that in a time before widespread scientific understanding, before modern psychology, before the ability to record sound or easily disseminate information, interpretations of strange phenomena were deeply rooted in faith and folklore. Was it a true auditory event? Mass hysteria? Pious fabrication? A genuine miracle? This is where the historical debate truly begins. Historians still argue whether accounts of unusual phenomena associated with relics, including claims of sounds or movement, represent genuine belief in the miraculous, psychological effects of intense devotion and exhaustion, or deliberate hoaxes perpetuated by institutions or individuals. It's hard to pin down centuries later, isn't it? Was it a miracle? Was it Monday? Who knows? But the fact that the idea existed, that accounts or legends persisted, suggesting relics weren't always silent, inert objects, but could perhaps emit sounds, even sounds like cries or screams, tells you something fascinating about the medieval mind and the intense, sometimes overwhelming, nature of faith and pilgrimage. You embark on this journey seeking connection to the divine, seeking miracles. Your mind is primed, your body exhausted, your emotions heightened. You are, in short, in a state where the extraordinary might seem not just possible, but perhaps even likely. And in that state, kneeling before a sacred object, maybe even one with a particularly dramatic backstory, what might you hear? What might your fervent, weary mind conjure? The journey has just begun. You're still standing at the metaphorical edge of medieval Europe, the long road stretching ahead. You've caught a glimpse of the profound importance of relics, the arduous reality of pilgrimage, and the strange, intriguing hint that sometimes the holiest objects might have been the source of the most unexpected sounds. Let's keep walking, shall we? You've just had this weird, slightly spooky thought planted in your mind. What if these supposedly inert objects, these holy relics, weren't always silent? It rattles around a bit because it challenges the simple image you might have had. But to understand why that idea, however fringe, might have taken root, you need to grasp just how central and powerful these things were in the first place. So, what were these relics, really? At their core, they were physical remnants associated with saints, martyrs, or Christ himself. Think of them as tangible anchors to the divine, little pieces of heaven, or at least people who were believed to be in heaven, here on earth. There was, in fact, a kind of hierarchy to this divine stuff. The most important, the gold standard, if you like, were what they called primary relics. These were actual body parts, bones, skulls, teeth, even hair or blood, of saints and martyrs. Owning a saint's femur, huge status symbol for a church. Got their entire skeleton? You've basically hit the medieval religious jackpot. Then came secondary relics, objects that had been in close contact with the saint during their life, like clothing they wore, a staff they used, or even pieces of their tomb. And finally, you had tertiary relics, which were often small cloths or pieces of material that had been touched to a primary or secondary relic. It was like a chain of holiness, radiating out from the source. Touch the thing that touched the thing. But it wasn't just about having a piece of someone holy, it was about the power believed to reside within it. Medieval theology held that a saint, though in heaven, was still connected to their earthly remains. A relic wasn't just a memento, it was a conduit, a place where the saint's virtus, their spiritual power or energy, was still active and accessible. Kneeling before a saint's bone fragment wasn't just about remembering them, it was about placing yourself in the immediate presence of their sanctity, hoping to tap into that power. It was like having a spiritual battery pack nearby, ready to give you a little divine juice. This belief in the active power of relics is why they were so central to medieval life, and why churches and monasteries went to extraordinary lengths to acquire them. They weren't just decorations for the altar, they were the main event. A church with a famous relic could draw crowds from miles around, sometimes hundreds or even thousands of miles. People believed these relics could perform miracles, heal the sick, restore sight to the blind, even raise the dead. Though accounts of that last one are, shall we say, less common and perhaps require an even sleepier and more credulous mind than ours tonight. They were also sought for protection, carrying a small relic, or praying before a journey, or a battle was thought to offer divine safeguarding. Imagine the scene. You finally arrived at a renowned shrine after weeks on the road, your feet aching, your clothes threadbare. You shuffle forward with a crowd of others, all weary and hopeful, into the reliquary chapel. The air is thick with the scent of incense and the low murmur of prayers. For you sits a magnificent reliquary, perhaps a golden box encrusted with jewels, shaped like an arm or a head, or a tiny intricate chapel, all designed to honor the precious fragment within. You gaze at it, this physical link to someone holy, someone believed to be in direct communion with God. You pray you might reach out to touch the reliquary itself. Actual touching of the relic was often restricted, especially the primary ones. Wouldn't want to lose a finger bone, would you? And in that moment, in that charged atmosphere, with all your hopes and fears focused on this object, the belief in its power feels utterly real, utterly overwhelming. This mainstream historical fact is crucial. The veneration of relics was not a minor aspect of medieval Christianity. It was absolutely fundamental, shaping theology, liturgy, art, architecture, and the daily lives of millions of people across Europe. Cathedrals were literally built around the chapels housing their most important relics. The entire economy of a town could revolve around the influx of pilgrims coming to see a saint's toe or a vial of questionable holy milk. Yes, that was a thing. And oh, the variety of relics. While the bones of apostles and martyrs were the A-listers, the medieval relic market, and yes, it was absolutely a market, sometimes a very shady one, was booming with a truly astonishing array of items. You had fragments of the true cross everywhere, enough, skeptics later calculated, to build several ships, leading to jokes about the world's fastest growing tree. There were supposed vials of Christ's tears, sweat, or even laughter. Imagine the relic of a divine chuckle. Pieces of the Virgin Mary's veil, strands of her hair, or, in one particularly odd case, a feather dropped by the Archangel Gabriel during the Annunciation. You had items related to everyday biblical life, a piece of the manger, a thorn from the crown, even supposedly footprints Christ left in a stone. This is your quirky fringe tidbit. The proliferation of often highly imaginative and sometimes clearly fraudulent relics highlights the intense demand and the less than rigorous verification processes of the era. If you could spin a good yarn about how you acquired that lump of dirt being from the Garden of Eden, you might just find a buyer. Medieval authentication standards were, shall we say, a bit less stringent than modern forensic science. Given the fervent belief, the intense emotional atmosphere surrounding these objects, and the sheer strangeness of some of the claims, it's perhaps less surprising that unusual experiences might be reported. If a church's income depended on pilgrims believing their relic was miraculous, wasn't there an incentive to encourage such beliefs? This brings us to a key scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the widespread trade and veneration of relics in the Middle Ages was primarily driven by genuine piety and belief in their spiritual power, or by the economic and political advantages they offered to churches and rulers who possessed them. It was probably a bit of both, wasn't it? Faith and finance, a classic medieval cocktail. So you have these objects, bones, clothes, random bits and bobs, imbued with immense spiritual significance, believed to be active participants in the divine realm, displayed in elaborate containers, and visited by thousands of hopeful, weary travelers. The air around them is thick with expectation, prayer, and the collective hopes and fears of a devoted crowd. And in this environment, the line between the natural and the supernatural feels incredibly thin. You're primed for a miracle, expecting the extraordinary. What happens when your senses, perhaps heightened by exhaustion and devotion, interpret something unexpected emanating from that sacred space? What happens when the silence is broken? So you've got the relics, the star players, the supposed conduits of divine power. You've got the churches, the elaborate, often dimly lit stages where they were displayed. Now bring in the audience, the pilgrims. These weren't your average Sunday churchgoers. These were people who had often undertaken arduous journeys, sometimes for weeks or months, leaving behind their homes, families, and livelihoods. They were driven by a potent mix of faith, desperation, and hope. Maybe they were sick and seeking a miraculous cure. Maybe they had committed a sin and were seeking penance. Maybe they were simply fulfilling a vow or hoping for good fortune. Whatever the reason, they arrived at these shrines physically exhausted and emotionally primed. Think about what that journey would have been like. No comfy trains or planes here. You were walking, maybe riding a donkey if you were lucky, through often dangerous landscapes. You faced bad weather, bad roads, bandits, and the constant threat of illness. Every step was an act of faith, a physical manifestation of your devotion. By the time you finally arrived, you weren't just tired. You were probably running on fumes, pure adrenaline, and a belief that this journey, this suffering, was going to lead to something profound, something life-changing. And then you step into the shrine. It's not just a building, it's an assault on your senses, carefully orchestrated to amplify the sacred atmosphere. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax candles and incense. Not that subtle modern stuff, but heavy, potent fragrances that hang in the air. Your eyes, accustomed to the glare of the sun or the gloom of the road, adjust to the flickering candlelight, illuminating intricate carvings in stained glass windows depicting saints and biblical scenes. The windows might be depicting the very saint whose bone you've come to venerate. It's a multimedia experience, medieval style. The sounds are different too. The low hum of chanting from the clergy, the individual whispers of prayers from hundreds of other pilgrims, the shuffle of feet, maybe the clanging of a censer. It's a cacophony of devotion, a collective soundscape of yearning and hope, and the sheer visual spectacle. The altars are draped in rich fabrics, golden vessels gleam in the candlelight, and at the center of it all, the reliquary itself, often a masterpiece of goldsmithing encrusted with jewels, designed to awe and inspire reverence. It's beautiful, it's overwhelming, and it's designed to make you feel incredibly small and incredibly close to the divine. This is a mainstream historical fact. The medieval pilgrimage experience was intensely physical, emotional, and sensory. The architecture, art, and liturgical practices of shrines were deliberately crafted to create an atmosphere of awe and heightened religious feeling, intended to deepen the pilgrim's faith and perception of the sacred. It wasn't just about showing up, it was about being immersed, transformed, and overwhelmed by the experience. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a spiritual theme park ride, minus the motion sickness, unless you ate some questionable pilgrim stew on the road. In this state of heightened expectation, physical exhaustion, and sensory immersion, the mind is incredibly susceptible. You've walked all this way, endured hardships. You need this to be real. You need the miracle, the healing, the forgiveness. Your brain is actively looking for confirmation, for a sign that your journey and your faith haven't been in vain. It's like when you really want a specific ice cream flavor. Suddenly you start seeing signs for it everywhere. Your brain is already halfway there. This intense psychological state is crucial. When you are desperately hoping for something extraordinary, your perception can be easily influenced. A creak in the ancient stone could sound like a whisper. A trick of the light could look like movement. The collective emotional energy of the crowd could feel like a tangible force. Your brain, already anticipating a divine intervention, might interpret ambiguous stimuli in a way that confirms your deepest desires or fears. It's like that moment right before you fall asleep, when your brain conjures up all sorts of bizarre images. Your conscious filter is just a little bit off. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit that ties into this. There are accounts from the medieval period, often in miracle collections associated with shrines, of pilgrims experiencing strange phenomena not just related to healing, but to sounds or sensations seemingly emanating from the relics themselves. These accounts aren't necessarily mainstream miracles like the blind seeing, but more like unusual, subjective experiences reported by individuals in the hypercharged atmosphere of the reliquary chapel. Sometimes they describe feeling intense heat or cold, smelling unusual fragrances beyond the incense, or hearing faint, indistinct noises that seem to have no earthly source. Were they real, or were they products of exhaustion, suggestion, and intense expectation? This brings us to a key scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether reports of miraculous or unusual occurrences at medieval shrines were primarily genuine divine interventions, psychosomatic responses triggered by faith in the charged environment, or outright fabrications for propaganda purposes. It's incredibly difficult to untangle these possibilities centuries later, especially when the sources are often hagiographies or miracle registers compiled by the very institutions that benefited from such reports. Did someone truly hear a sound from the reliquary, or did they expect to hear something miraculous, and their mind filled in the blanks? Imagine being there. You finally reach the front of the line. You kneel, your heart pounding. You gaze at the reliquary, maybe just inches away now. The candlelight flickers. The prayers around you swell. You close your eyes for a moment, focusing all your energy, all your faith on the object before you. And then, maybe, just maybe, you hear something faint. A tiny sound, like a rustle or a seta or a distant whisper. It's gone as quickly as it came. Was it real, or was it just the sound of the wind whistling through a high window? The creak of ancient wood settling? Or was it your hopeful, desperate mind projecting onto the silence? In that moment, surrounded by the weight of centuries of faith and expectation, it would be very easy to believe you had experienced something truly extraordinary, something from the relic itself, especially when everyone around you is whispering about miracles. Peer pressure, but make it holy. The stage is set, potent relics, overwhelming shrines, and pilgrims in a state of intense physical and emotional readiness. It's the perfect environment for the boundary between the physical and the spiritual to blur, for subjective experience to be interpreted as objective reality. And this is where the story takes a turn towards the truly unsettling. The moments when those subjective interpretations weren't just about feeling warm or hearing a whisper, but about something far more dramatic. Something like screams. You're in that charged atmosphere, the sensory overload, the desperate hope clinging to you like the damp wool of your pilgrim cloak. You've maybe heard faint sounds, felt strange sensations, or convinced yourself you did. But then the whispers in the chapel start to shift. They're not just about miraculous cures anymore, or visions of saints. They're about sounds. Specific sounds, sounds that aren't holy chants or rustling robes. And the most disturbing reports, the ones that really began to circulate, weren't about faint whispers or gentle sighs. They were about screams. Not loud, earth-shattering screams, mind you. Not at first, anyway. These were described more like muffled cries, distant wails, or sounds that seemed to carry the resonance of deep suffering. Imagine being in a quiet room and hearing a sound you can't quite place, but it sends a shiver down your spine. That's closer to the feeling being described. These reports weren't uniform, of course. They weren't like someone hitting a cosmic scream button on all the reliquaries simultaneously. Different shrines at different times began to have these isolated incidents reported by pilgrims. One account might come from a shrine dedicated to a martyr saint, another from a place holding a piece of the true cross. The locations varied, but the core element was the same. Sounds that seemed incongruous with the holy object they were emanating from, sounds that suggested distress or pain. Think about the implications. If a relic, a piece of a saint, or a holy object connected to Christ, is supposed to be a conduit of divine grace, of healing, of holiness, what does it mean if it sounds like it's screaming? It flies in the face of everything you believe about it. It's like buying a fancy, expensive spiritual gadget, and it starts making weird noises instead of performing miracles. Very bad customer service from the afterlife. The immediate reactions varied wildly, often depending on the local clergy and the prevailing beliefs. Some saw it as a sign of the saints' continued suffering for humanity, a kind of eternal empathy manifesting audibly. Others whispered it was the souls of the damned crying out near holiness, perhaps trying to reach it or tormented by its presence. A few inevitably feared demonic interference, the devil trying to sow doubt and fear by making holy objects seem distressed or corrupted. This emergence of specific, disturbing sonic phenomena marks a shift. It moves from the general possibility of subjective, faith-driven experiences, like feeling warmth or hearing faint whispers, to concrete, if unverified, claims of alarming sounds emanating from the relics themselves. These weren't just individual perceptions. They started to become stories that were shared among pilgrims, gaining traction, sometimes recorded in miracle collections or chronicles, adding a new, unsettling layer to the veneration of relics. A mainstream historical fact here is that medieval miracle accounts often included not just physical healings, but also reports of strange phenomena, visions, and auditory experiences associated with sacred sites and relics. These accounts served multiple purposes. They reinforced the power and sanctity of the relic and the shrine. They provided solace and hope to pilgrims, and they could also be used by the clergy to interpret events and guide belief. The inclusion of potentially unsettling phenomena, if framed correctly, as the saints' suffering or victory over evil, could paradoxically increase awe and reverence rather than diminish it. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit related to these sounds, among the many types of sounds occasionally reported, beyond the screams, were sometimes described as the rattling of chains, the sounds of struggle, or even low moans. These were often interpreted through the lens of the saint's life. Perhaps they were suffering again for the sins of the world, or fighting against unseen evil forces. It adds another layer to the already complex medieval soundscape of faith. You didn't just have bells and chants, but potentially the sounds of spiritual warfare emanating from a jeweled box. It's like finding out your grandmother's antique music box plays death metal when you wind it up. Completely unexpected. Historians still argue whether these early reports of screams and other disturbing sounds were genuine misinterpretations of ambient noises, like wind, structural sounds, or sounds from outside the chapel, mass hysteria or suggestion among pilgrims, or possibly fabricated stories intended to enhance the drama and spiritual significance of the relic. It's hard to prove or disprove claims from centuries ago that rely entirely on witness testimony and were recorded by people with a vested interest in the shrine's reputation. Imagine trying to verify this today. Someone says, "That bone fragment in the fancy box just screamed." You'd set up microphones, seismic sensors, maybe even call in an acoustician. In the medieval period, you called in a priest. His method of verification was probably less about decibels and more about prayer and maybe an exorcism ritual, just in case. Very different investigative journalism back then. The key is that these reports, once they started, didn't just disappear. They became part of the narrative around certain relics or shrines. They added a layer of mystery, even fear, but also a sense of intense, raw spiritual power. The relics weren't just silent objects, they were seemingly active, capable of expressing something, even if that something was a sound of anguish, rather than divine joy. This made the pilgrim experience even more unpredictable, even more potentially overwhelming. and it set the stage for these strange sonic events to gain more attention, leading to attempts to understand, control, or explain them on a larger scale. The era of potentially screaming bones had truly begun. So you've experienced or heard tell of these unsettling sounds emanating from what should be sources of calm and holiness. The whispers have become louder, the potential shrieks more insistent in the retelling. And as these stories circulate among the pilgrim paths, in the market squares outside the abbey walls, and even back home in the villages, they inevitably reach the ears of the people who manage these sacred spaces. The church. Now, the church in the medieval period wasn't like a single monolithic corporation with a central PR department designed to handle reports of malfunctioning holy items. It was a complex web of local bishops, abbots, priors, cathedral chapters, and various levels of hierarchy all the way up to the Pope in Rome. Their reactions were far from uniform. But the growing volume of these claims, especially if they were tied to prominent shrines attracting significant pilgrim traffic and donations, let's be honest, couldn't be entirely ignored. Imagine being a busy abbot or a bishop. You're dealing with administrative tasks, managing lands and finances, resolving local disputes, overseeing liturgical practices, and probably trying to fend off various political pressures. Then reports start trickling in. Father, Pilgrim Jacques swears the arm of Saint Fiacre was wailing yesterday. Or, my Lord Bishop, people are saying the peace of the Virgin's veil at St. Mary's sounds like someone sobbing. At first, you might dismiss it as peasant superstition, overactive imaginations fueled by exhaustion and fervor. But if the reports persist, if multiple pilgrims independently claim similar experiences, if the story starts to affect the reputation of your shrine, perhaps scaring some potential pilgrims away, or conversely drawing others hoping for a dramatic spiritual encounter, you have to do something. The church's approach wasn't a modern scientific investigation. There were no sound engineers dispatched with decibel meters. Instead, inquiries would typically involve questioning the people who made the claims, often under oath or in a formal setting. Clergy would interview multiple witnesses, trying to discern if there were inconsistencies in their stories, if they seemed credible, or if they had a reputation for piety, or conversely, for seeking attention or causing trouble. They might also question the monks or canons who were custodians of the relic. Had they heard anything? What were the conditions in the chapel at the time? Was it windy? Were there people nearby who might have been making noise? They would also consult theological experts. What did the church fathers say about relics and spiritual manifestations? Was there precedent for saints communicating in such ways after death? How could such sounds be interpreted within church doctrine? Could it be a test of faith, a sign of divine displeasure? Or perhaps, as some suggested, the saint's soul still experiencing some form of purgatorial or earthly suffering on behalf of humanity? Rationales began to be proposed and disseminated, often tailored to the specific circumstances or the perceived character of the sounds. If the sound was interpreted as a wail or cry of pain, the explanation might lean towards the saint's empathy or continued suffering for the world's sins. If it sounded more like a struggle or a rattling, it might be framed as the saint continuing their battle against demonic forces, using the relic as a spiritual anchor point. This allowed the church to maintain the relic's sanctity while acknowledging the strange phenomenon. It wasn't the relic itself being distressed in a negative way, it was performing a spiritual function that manifested audibly. However, a significant effort was also made to provide explanations that, while perhaps not strictly scientific in our sense, were within the realm of known physical or human causes in the medieval world. These attempts often reveal the limitations of their understanding of acoustics, psychology, and even basic physics. They might suggest that the sounds were caused by wind whistling through cracks in the chapel walls or the reliquary itself. Or perhaps it was sounds from birds or small animals nesting nearby that were amplified or distorted by the stone structure. Sometimes the sounds of people moving or speaking in other parts of the building could be attributed. Think of how sound carries and echoes in old stone churches. It's easy to imagine how a faint noise could be misidentified. There were also explanations rooted in human behavior and psychology. The sheer emotional intensity of the pilgrim experience, combined with exhaustion fasting, and the power of suggestion could lead people to hear things that weren't there. If one person reported hearing a sound, others might subconsciously or consciously believe they heard it too. This is the medieval equivalent of convincing yourself you heard your phone vibrate when it didn't. Very relatable, even across centuries. A mainstream historical fact relevant here is that the medieval church, while emphasizing the miraculous, also developed systems for investigating and authenticating miracles and relics. These processes, while not based on empirical science as we know it, involve gathering testimony, examining evidence, like claimed cures, and seeking consensus among learned clergy. Reports of strange phenomena like sounds would fall under this investigative umbrella, requiring some form of official response, whether it was endorsement, interpretation, or dismissal. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit regarding the church's proposed explanations. One documented account mentions a bishop suggesting that the sounds might be caused by trapped air or vapors within the reliquary or the surrounding structure that were being released due to changes in temperature or pressure. Imagine trying to explain a scream as a spiritual burp. Yes, my child, that wasn't St. Cuthbert wailing. That was merely celestial gas escaping his ossuary. It highlights the struggle to find non-supernatural explanations using the limited understanding of the natural world available at the time. Another approach, perhaps less explained and more controlled, was to physically attempt to dampen or muffle the reliquary. Some accounts suggest attempts were made to enclose screaming relics in heavier, thicker casings or even layers of fabric or wax in the hope of literally muffling the sound, whether it was physical or spiritual in origin. It's like putting a pillow over your kid sister's mouth, but for a saint's toe bone. Historians still argue whether the church's varied responses were primarily driven by a genuine attempt to understand the phenomena, a need to control potentially disruptive popular beliefs, or a calculated effort to either leverage the dramatic reports for increased devotion and revenue, or suppress them if they seemed too unsettling or uncontrollable. The motivations were likely a complex mix, varying by location and the individuals involved. Was the bishop genuinely convinced it was celestial gas? Or was that just the least alarming explanation he could concoct to make the screaming bone sound less existentially terrifying? The effectiveness of these official explanations varied hugely. For some pilgrims, the church's interpretation, say the saint fighting demons, might deepen their faith in awe. For others, a dismissive explanation might feel unsatisfactory, especially if they felt certain about what they had heard. The attempts to provide natural causes, wind, acoustics, might have convinced some, but seemed insufficient to others who believed they had witnessed something truly miraculous or terrifying. Crucially, despite these efforts, the reports didn't entirely go away. The church could offer explanations, conduct inquiries, and issue pronouncements, but they couldn't unhear what pilgrims claimed to have heard. The stories persisted, taking on a life of their own, sometimes confirming official interpretations, sometimes contradicting them, and sometimes simply adding to the mystique and unpredictable nature of these powerful holy objects. The official narrative was being written, but so was the unofficial one, whispered in the dormitories and alongside the dusty roads. And the gap between those two narratives would become fertile ground for further mystery and speculation. So, the official pronouncements are made, the quiet inquiries conducted, and explanations, from theologically dense to frankly gaseous, are offered by the church authorities. But while the abbots ponder celestial vapors and the bishops interview witnesses, what's happening on the ground? What are the people who are actually doing the trudging, the praying, the coin dropping, and potentially the ear witnessing, saying about all this? You as a pilgrim are not an isolated unit. You travel with others, you stay in hospices or inns crowded with fellow travelers. You swap stories around crackling fires or while huddled under sparse trees during a sudden shower. The Pilgrim Road is a buzzing network of gossip, rumor, advice, and shared experience. And stories about screaming relics, oh boy, those are prime conversational currency. Imagine you've just arrived at a market town near a major shrine you plan to visit tomorrow. You're tired, your feet ache, Maybe you've developed that specific pilgrim limp that becomes oddly comfortable after a few weeks. You find a place in a crowded common room, perhaps grabbing a simple meal of bread and ale, and you overhear snippets of conversation. Heard old Thomas from Picardy swear blind, the finger bone shrieked like a stuck pig. My sister's cousin's neighbor was there, said it sounded like a woman weeping. And Father Michael said it's just the wind, but how can wind sound like that? This is where the real processing happens. Away from the solemn chapels and the watchful eyes of the clergy, pilgrims debated these claims among themselves. Was it true? Did you hear anything when you were there? Did you feel anything strange? The discussions would range from devout awe to outright skepticism, sometimes within the same conversation. For many, the idea of a relic producing sound, especially a distressing one, could be deeply unsettling. Relics were meant to be conduits to the divine, sources of comfort, healing, and intercession. A screaming relic felt wrong, like your favorite blanket suddenly biting you. It challenged their understanding of the sacred object. Was the saint suffering? Was God angry? Or was it something more sinister, perhaps the work of the devil attempting to mock or undermine the sacred? This fear could genuinely deter some pilgrims, making them hesitant to approach certain shrines, or at least approach them with a significant degree of trepidation. You might find yourself whispering extra prayers as you got closer, just in case. But for others, the reports had the opposite effect. The very strangeness of it made the relic more compelling, more powerful. If the arm bone of Saint Whoever was literally wailing, it proved it wasn't just a dusty old bone. It was active. It was alive with spiritual energy. It was a sign that the saint was still incredibly potent, perhaps still suffering on humanity's behalf, or engaged in some cosmic struggle. These pilgrims might actively seek out shrines known for these audible phenomena, hoping for a dramatic, undeniable encounter with the sacred. It's the medieval equivalent of chasing a spiritual thunderstorm, terrifying, but potentially awe-inspiring. The shared experience reinforced the beliefs. If you heard a faint, odd sound, and then someone else you respected said they heard it too, perhaps louder or clearer, your own perception was validated. The collective narrative began to solidify, and as stories passed from person to person, they naturally evolved. Details were added, exaggerated, misinterpreted, or woven together. The strange sound could become a whisper, then a groan, then a shriek. The description of the sound might change based on the listener's own fears or hopes. Did you have a particular worry you were praying about? Maybe the sound you heard from the relic was interpreted as a sympathetic sob. Were you seeking protection from illness? Perhaps the rattling you perceived was the saint shaking off demonic influence. The stories became mirrors for the pilgrim's own spiritual and emotional landscapes. This phenomenon is fascinating because it highlights the dynamic interplay between official church doctrine and popular belief. While the church might try to provide a controlled narrative, the pilgrim community was actively co-creating and distributing its own version of events. They were interpreters, storytellers, and accidental amplifiers of phenomena the hierarchy sometimes struggled to explain or manage. Think about the sheer diversity of the pilgrim community. You might be traveling alongside a wealthy merchant, a humble peasant, a former soldier, a pious widow, a traveling scholar. Each brought their own background, education, or lack thereof, superstitions, and understanding of the world. A scholar might try to intellectualize the phenomenon, perhaps seeking obscure texts on acoustics or spiritual physics. A peasant might attribute it directly to divine intervention or demonic trickery, rooted in local folk beliefs. A merchant might grumble about the unsettling noise potentially scaring off potential visitors and their money. This mixing pot of perspectives meant the stories were filtered through many different lenses. And crucially, these stories didn't stay on the pilgrim road. You weren't planning to live out your days shuffling between shrines. Eventually, you'd return home. And what's the first thing everyone wants to hear? Stories. Tell us about your pilgrimage. What did you see? What miracles did you witness? Did you hear anything strange? The tales of screaming relics would become part of the return journey's narrative. They'd be recounted in village squares, over family dinners, in local taverns, in parish churches. The original nuance or uncertainty would often be smoothed away in the retelling. Yes, I was there, you might say, perhaps puffing up your chest slightly, and the hand of Saint Benedict did moan clear as day. It sounded like a wounded beast. Even if what you'd actually heard was a faint creak that someone else had interpreted dramatically, the story, once absorbed and retold, became your experience. This oral transmission was the primary means of spreading information in the medieval period. While some literate pilgrims might keep journals, the vast majority relied on speaking and listening. This made the stories highly mutable, like a game of historical telephone played across hundreds of miles and years. The tale of a slightly odd noise at one shrine could merge with a similar report from another, creating a composite legend that applied to multiple relics or intensified the phenomenon at a single location. A mainstream historical fact important here is the sheer scale and cultural significance of medieval pilgrimage. Millions of people undertook journeys to shrines across Europe for a huge variety of reasons: penance, healing, fulfilling vows, seeking adventure, trade, or simply out of piety. These journeys were not just religious acts, they were major social, economic, and informational events. Pilgrim routes were vital arteries for the flow of ideas, goods, and yes, gossip and stories. The communal nature of the journey meant that experiences, whether mundane or miraculous, were quickly shared and discussed, creating a powerful feedback loop for popular belief. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit about how pilgrims reacted. Some accounts or legends hint at pilgrims attempting to communicate with the sounds. Imagine someone kneeling before a reliquary known for its weeping, and instead of just praying to the saint, they might softly whisper questions at the reliquary, hoping for a responsive moan or cry that they could interpret as a sign or answer. It's a very human reaction to something that feels responsive, even if it's just sound. Treating the relic not just as an object, but as something capable of interaction, albeit via nonverbal, unsettling noises. One particularly colorful, though likely embellished tale describes a group of pilgrims trying to sing hymns at a screaming reliquary, in hopes that the sound would turn from a wail into a harmonic hum, signaling the saint was appeased or pleased. Unsurprisingly, the screeching reportedly continued unabated, much to their disappointment, or perhaps increased terror. Historians still argue whether these pilgrim-driven narratives of audible relics were primarily generated from genuine, if misinterpreted, sensory experiences, mass hysteria, and the power of suggestion, or deliberate fabrication fueled by competition between shrines or individuals seeking attention. It's incredibly difficult to untangle centuries of oral transmission and varied interpretation. Were people really hearing something, or were they just expecting to, or wanting to? And did the church's attempts to explain things sometimes just provide fuel for the fire, giving pilgrims a framework, however strange, through which to interpret ambiguous sounds? What is clear is that the pilgrim community played a crucial role in shaping the legacy of these phenomena. They were not passive recipients of information or doctrine. They were active participants in the creation and dissemination of these strange stories. Their discussions, debates, and retellings ensured that the tales of screaming relics didn't just fade away like a forgotten whisper. They became embedded in the popular consciousness, adding a layer of mystery, fear, and sometimes enhanced devotion to the veneration of relics. The whispers they heard, real or imagined, echoed far beyond the stone walls of the chapels, carried on the wind of their returning journeys, transforming the quiet veneration of bones into tales of unsettling, audible power. So, you've seen how the stories ripple outwards through the pilgrim community, gaining momentum and color as they pass from mouth to ear. But while the pilgrims are swapping tales in crowded hostels, what are the people in charge doing? The clergy, the abbots, the bishops, the folks whose job it is to manage these sacred spaces and the faithful who flock to them. They can't exactly ignore the persistent rumors that their holy objects are staging spontaneous sound and light shows. Well, just sound, mercifully. The official church response to any reported miracle or unusual phenomenon was, in theory, a process of cautious investigation. This wasn't like your local neighborhood watch complaining about a noisy dog. This involves sacred objects, potentially divine or diabolical intervention, and the reputation of the entire institution. You can imagine the scene. Senior clerics, perhaps looking weary and distinctly unmiraculous themselves, sitting around a heavy oak table, listening to reports. They'd interview the witnesses. You, potentially, if you were unlucky enough to be directly involved and identifiable. They'd question the monks or canons responsible for the care of the relic. They'd examine the reliquary itself, probably tapping it gently, looking inside if possible, maybe holding it up to the light. Was there a hidden mechanism? Was it near a drafty window? Was Brother Thomas perhaps prone to theatrical interpretations of mundane sounds? The church hierarchy faced a delicate balancing act. On one hand, they were the custodians of faith and doctrine. They needed to distinguish genuine divine manifestations from fraud, delusion, or even demonic deception. A truly miraculous event, properly authenticated, could massively enhance the prestige and drawing power of a shrine, cha-ching. But a false one could be deeply embarrassing or even scandalous. On the other hand, dismissing all claims risked alienating the faithful and dampening the very piety that pilgrimage represented. Imagine telling a devout pilgrim who swears they heard St. Catherine weep that they were just hearing things. Or worse, were victims of their own overactive imagination. Not exactly great customer service. So they often sought explanations that were rational within their understanding of the world, which, let's be honest, included a much wider range of potential causes than your average modern scientist would entertain. Divine will? Yes, that was always on the table. Demonic activity? Absolutely. The devil was constantly trying to trick people. But also natural explanations, interpreted through a medieval lens. Drafts, echoes, structural settling, animal noises, even collective emotional states. Sometimes the official explanations could be creative. One suggested cause, reportedly considered by some clerics when confronted with groaning reliquaries housed in resonant stone chapels, was that the collective sins of the pilgrims present were somehow resonating within the sacred space and causing the holy object to emit sounds of distress or sympathetic suffering. You, standing there, trying to be pious and maybe just heard a weird creak, are now told your own moral failings are making the saint's finger bone moan. Talk about a guilt trip. That's certainly one way to encourage more vigorous confession and perhaps a larger offering plate contribution. Another, slightly more grounded, but still fantastical to modern ears. Explanations sometimes floated involved atmospheric conditions or vapors interacting with the sacred materials. The idea was that certain relics or their containers might somehow be sensitive to humidity, temperature fluctuations, or even spiritual energies in the air, causing them to vibrate or produce sound. It sounds like something you'd find in a Victorian pseudoscientific treatise on ectoplasm. But in a world where people genuinely believed in humors and miasmas, it wasn't entirely outside the realm of possibility. You might hear a sermon where the priest, looking very learned, explains that the relic's current whispering phase is due to a particular confluence of heavenly alignment and earthly dampness. Right, just like your car won't start because Mercury is in retrograde and it rained last night. A mainstream historical fact here is that the medieval church had well-established procedures, however subjective they might seem now, for investigating potential miracles, canonization candidates, and holy relics. These processes involve testimony gathering, theological evaluation, and sometimes even physical examination. Though physical examination of a relic mostly meant looking at the casket or maybe the bone itself, not running lab tests, obviously. Bishops had officials whose specific role was to investigate claims of supernatural occurrences. These investigations were serious business, intended to maintain order, uphold doctrine, and protect the church's credibility. They weren't just shrugging and saying, "Oh, well, saints will be saints." However, these formal investigations often moved slowly and could be influenced by local politics, the reputation of the shrine, and the social standing of the witnesses. While the official inquiry plodded along, the pilgrim stories continued to spread and solidify. This often created a disconnect between the cautious sometimes convoluted official explanations, and the simpler, more dramatic narratives circulating among the people. The church might issue a pronouncement that the sound was merely a resonant echo caused by monks chanting with particular fervor during a storm, while the pilgrims were already convinced it was the voice of Saint Agnes crying out against heresy. Sometimes the official explanation, however strange, would itself get absorbed into the popular narrative, adding another layer to the legend. Yes, the bishop said it was vapors, you might hear someone say in the market, but everyone knows that those vapors are only produced when the saint is deeply troubled by the king's latest decree. The official attempt to rationalize became just another peculiar detail in the story of the strange relic. This process highlights a fascinating, quirky, or fringe tidbit: the sheer effort some monastic communities went to in order to manage the perception around their relics. There are scattered accounts, often satirical or critical, suggesting that in some cases monks might have encouraged or subtly amplified ambiguous sounds if they thought it would enhance the relic's reputation, perhaps leaving a window open strategically or ensuring a particularly creaky floorboard was near the reliquary. It's the medieval equivalent of adding sound effects to boost ticket sales. While outright fakery was condemned, there's a blurry line between honest interpretation of ambiguous phenomena and a little bit of helpful stagecraft. Imagine a monk practicing his distressed relic moan in the privacy of his cell, just in case. Needs more spiritual anguish, less like indigestion. Historians still argue whether the church's handling of these phenomena primarily aimed to control and suppress popular superstition, or whether it was a genuine attempt to integrate inexplicable events into a theological framework, or perhaps a blend of both driven by the practical needs of managing pilgrims and shrine finances. It's hard to gauge the true intentions behind centuries-old pronouncements and investigations. Did they genuinely believe the sin vapors theory, or was it a convenient, pious-sounding explanation that shifted blame onto the congregation? What is clear is that the institutional response, whether dismissive, rationalizing, or cautiously accepting, played a significant role. It provided a backdrop against which the pilgrim narratives were told, debated, and interpreted. It lent a certain weight to the stories, even if the official explanation differed wildly from popular belief. The fact that the church was investigating, discussing, and sometimes offering explanations for these sounds meant they couldn't simply be dismissed as peasant folklore. They were phenomena, however categorized, that intersected with the sacred and the official. And you, as a pilgrim caught in this current, were navigating a world where the line between the miraculous, the mundane, and the outright bizarre was often blurred by faith, rumor, and the sometimes confounding pronouncements from on high. Your personal experience of a sound or a story about a sound was constantly being recontextualized by the chatter around you and the distant pronouncements from the stone walls of the abbey. So you've got the official church pronouncements, sometimes wild themselves, lending a strange sort of credibility to the reports. And you've got the pilgrim chatter, full of wonder and embellishment. But not everyone, not every single soul trudging the dusty roads or kneeling in the echoing chapels was ready to jump straight to saintly screaming or vibrations of sin. Even in the medieval period, a time often painted with broad strokes of universal, unquestioning faith, there were practical minds, skeptics, or simply people who had heard enough tall tales to be wary. You encounter them in the marketplaces outside the abbey walls, perhaps, or huddled around a fire in a less pious tavern rather than a pilgrim hostel. These are the folks who might listen to the latest breathless account of the groaning skull of St. Cuthbert and just raise an eyebrow. Maybe they shrug. Maybe they offer a different perspective, grounded not in miracles or demons, but in the everyday physics, as they understood it, of the world around them. Consider the buildings themselves, these great stone structures. The cathedrals and abbeys housing the precious relics were not static, silent entities. They were living, breathing, well, metaphorically, constructions, subject to the whims of weather, physics, and the passage of time. You stand inside one of these ancient chapels. The air is cool, perhaps damp, and the stone walls reach up into shadowed vaults. Any sound you make bounces and echoes in ways modern buildings rarely do. A dropped coin sounds like a hammer blow. A quiet cough becomes a resonant boom. So what about a building settling? Old timber shifting, stones grinding against each other under immense weight, a sudden gust of wind whistling through a poorly sealed window or a crack in the wall, creating an eerie moan. These are things people would have known about. They lived in houses that creaked and groaned, worked in barns where the wind howled through gaps. It wasn't a huge leap to suggest that maybe, just maybe, the sounds emanating from the vicinity of the reliquary weren't a saintly wail, but simply the old building doing what old buildings do. Like your knee making that clicking noise when you stand up too fast. Probably not a miracle, just wear and tear. Or what about animals? Birds nesting in the eaves, their shuffling and pecking potentially amplified by the acoustics. Rats or mice scurrying within the walls or beneath the floorboards, their tiny movements sounding larger in the quiet sanctity of the chapel. Even cats, sometimes kept to deal with vermin, could make unexpected noises. Imagine someone hearing a strange scratching near the relic and, instead of thinking angelic fingernails, immediately suspecting blasted rat, probably nibbling the holy wood. Not quite as spiritual, is it? But certainly a more grounded explanation for anyone who had ever dealt with pests. Some might point to the human element beyond just the Pilgrims' collective suggestibility. Were the monks themselves entirely above suspicion? Not necessarily of deliberate malice, but perhaps of exaggeration? Maybe they genuinely heard something ambiguous and, out of piety or a desire to impress pilgrims and their wallets, interpreted it as miraculous and shared the story with conviction. It's a bit like seeing a weird shape in the clouds and immediately deciding it's a sign from above, rather than just a weird shape in the clouds. The line between fervent belief and convenient interpretation can be thin. And then there's the possibility of outright fakery, however much the church condemned it. While perhaps rare in the most famous, heavily scrutinized shrines, in smaller, more desperate locations, could someone have devised a simple trick? A hidden whistle? A string attached to something that could rattle? A monk with a talent for ventriloquism? Okay, maybe less likely, but you get the idea. It's cynical, yes, but human history is full of people willing to bend the truth for gain, whether spiritual or material. You could imagine a weary pilgrim, having traveled hundreds of miles, whispering to their companion, "Honestly, sounds like Brother Francis clearing his throat again. Paid 3 silver pennies for this? I could have stayed home and listened to the pigs." One mainstream historical fact relevant here is that medieval society, while deeply religious, wasn't uniformly credulous. There were philosophical debates, discussions about the nature of reality and miracles, and certainly a degree of common sense observation. People understood natural phenomena, even if their scientific understanding differed from ours. Alchemists pursued natural explanations. Doctors relied on observation, however flawed by the humor theory. And ordinary people knew that wind howled and old buildings creaked. Skepticism wasn't an organized movement like modern atheism, but a practical inclination, a quiet doubt, or a preference for mundane explanations over extraordinary ones. You wouldn't write a bestseller called Debunking Holy Relics, but you might mutter your doubts into your ale. You might hear someone discussing the acoustics of the chapel. "See how the sound carries in here," they might say, gesturing at the vaulted ceiling. "Any little noise gets bounced around, could be anything." This isn't quite modern acoustic engineering, but it's a recognition that sound behaves differently in different spaces. They understood echoes. They understood resonance, perhaps intuitively. "That weird hum you heard?" "Ah, yes," a local might say. "That's just the choir practicing downstairs. The sound comes up through the stone." Again, not miraculous, just structural sound transfer. A quirky or fringe tidbit relates to the materials themselves. Some alternative explanations weren't purely natural in the modern sense, but linked the sounds to the inherent properties attributed to the materials in the medieval world. For instance, certain woods were believed to have specific qualities or even spirits. Metal could expand and contract. Perhaps the sounds weren't from the saint, but from the casket, the wood groaning in sympathy with the saint's suffering, or the metal responding to changes in spiritual temperature. It's an explanation that sits somewhere between purely natural and outright supernatural, a sort of animism applied to sacred objects. It's not St. Bartholomew crying out, someone might earnestly explain. It's the sacred oak of his reliquary, pained by the presence of heathens passing through town. Right, the wood is having feelings. Got it. Historians still argue whether this medieval skepticism was a significant countercurrent to popular belief or merely a scattered phenomenon among the more educated or pragmatic individuals. Was it safe to express such doubts publicly? Probably not in a way that undermined the church or a major shrine too directly, but quiet, private questioning was undoubtedly part of the human experience then as now. How prevalent were these alternative explanations? Did they gain traction, or were they quickly drowned out by the more exciting narratives of divine intervention? It's hard to say definitively from the historical record, which tends to focus on recorded miracles and official response rather than the muttered doubts of ordinary people. You, as a pilgrim, hearing these contrasting views, are caught in the middle. You've heard the fervent believers, seen the awe on their faces. You've heard the official pronouncements, however convoluted. And now you're hearing the doubters, the pragmatists, the ones who point to the creaking floorboards and the whistling wind. Which explanation makes sense to you? Does the echo in the chapel feel like a mere trick of sound? Or does it feel imbued with something more, something ancient and sacred? Maybe you try to test the theories yourself. You stand near the reliquary during a quiet moment. Do you hear drafts? Do you hear distant noises? Or do you hear something else? The wind howls outside. A dog barks in the distance. A monk coughs down the corridor. And then perhaps a faint, almost imperceptible sound near the reliquary. Is it the wood? Is it the stone? Is it just your imagination, primed by all the stories? Or is it truly the whisper of something ancient and holy? These moments of ambiguity are where the stories are born, where belief solidifies or doubt takes root. The skeptic hears the wind and confirms their suspicion. The believer hears the wind and interprets it as the saint's sigh. The sound itself might be the same, but the filter of faith, or lack thereof, changes everything. It's a bit like listening to that ambiguous audio illusion. Is it Yanni or Laurel? Your brain decides, and suddenly, that's all you can hear. Except in this case, your brain is deciding between just a draft and supernatural manifestation. Big difference. And in a world without microphones, spectral analysis, or even a basic understanding of acoustics, distinguishing between these things was incredibly difficult. You had to rely on your ears, your gut, and the collective interpretation of those around you. The skeptic might seem stubborn or even impious to the devout, while the believer might seem naive or gullible to the pragmatist. Everyone is listening to the same potential sounds, but they are living in slightly different realities, built from their own experiences, beliefs, and perhaps a healthy dose of confirmation bias. You hear what you are prepared to hear, and in the hushed, expectant atmosphere surrounding a holy relic, many were very prepared to hear something extraordinary. But not everyone. So you've got the faithful pilgrims convinced they've heard divine sighs, the pragmatic locals muttering about drafts, and somewhere in the middle, perhaps, the monks who live with these sacred objects day in and day out, potentially growing accustomed to the ambient noises of their ancient abbey. But these reports, especially if they became widespread or particularly dramatic, wouldn't just stay whispered among pilgrims and townspeople. Eventually, word would reach higher up the chain, to the bishops, the abbots, perhaps even the Pope himself, depending on the fame and significance of the relic. And the official church, with its complex hierarchy and vested interest in maintaining both piety and order, had to react. How did the church handle these reports of screaming relics? Well, it wasn't like they had a dedicated miracle investigation bureau with forensic equipment and lie detectors. Their process was more theological, bureaucratic, and sometimes surprisingly practical, mixed with a healthy dose of protecting the brand, if you will. For a major shrine, a report of a relic crying out wasn't just a curious local phenomenon. It was potentially a huge deal. It could boost the shrine's fame, attract more pilgrims, and their donations, let's not be entirely naive, and reinforce the spiritual power associated with the saint in the church itself. So there was often an initial inclination towards acceptance, a pious interpretation that saw these sounds as genuine signs of divine or saintly activity. You can imagine the scene. A bishop receives a report, perhaps a letter from an abbot, or word carried by a returning pilgrim of standing. Your Eminence, the report might say, we have received numerous accounts from devout pilgrims claiming that the skull of Saint whoever has been heard to groan and vibrate, particularly when sinners approach or during times of great spiritual need. The bishop's first thought probably wasn't, let's get an acoustician in here. It was more likely, interesting, a sign of the saint's continued power? A warning to the flock? How can we interpret this in a way that strengthens faith and upholds the dignity of the shrine? This led to what you could call pious interpretations. The sounds weren't random, they were meaningful. A groan, the saint lamenting the sins of the world. A vibration, the saint stirring perhaps in anger or anticipation of some event. A faint whisper, the saint offering comfort or a cryptic message. These interpretations were woven into sermons, shared among the clergy, and propagated to the pilgrims. The sounds weren't just noise. They were spiritual communication, filtered through the devout understanding of the church authorities. It's a bit like when your phone makes a weird noise and you immediately assume it's a notification, not just random electronic interference. You're primed to interpret it a certain way. However, alongside this pious acceptance, there was also a degree of scrutiny. The medieval church, while promoting belief in miracles, was also wary of false miracles. They had systems in place, however rudimentary by modern standards, to investigate claims, especially if they seemed too outlandish, contradictory to dogma, or perhaps suspiciously convenient for the local shrine. Bishops would send representatives, trusted canons or monks, to the shrine to observe, interview witnesses, and assess the situation. This wasn't quite scientific investigation, but it was an attempt to apply some level of critical evaluation within a theological framework. These investigators would talk to the monks who guarded the relic, question the pilgrims who claimed to have heard the sounds, and potentially spend time near the reliquary themselves listening. They might inquire about when the sounds occurred. Was it always at a specific time, during certain rituals, in the presence of particular individuals? They might also look for natural explanations, though perhaps not with the same intensity as our hypothetical modern acoustician. Was there construction nearby? Were there known issues with the building? They were looking for corroboration, consistency, and anything that smacked of deliberate deception or demonic influence, which was often the alternative explanation if it wasn't seen as saintly. One mainstream historical fact here is that the church, through various councils and papal decrees, developed established procedures for investigating potential miracles and the authenticity of relics. While the focus was often on healing miracles or visions, strange phenomena associated with relics also fell under this purview. The process involved gathering testimony, evaluating the character of the witnesses, and ultimately, judgment by church authorities. It wasn't a free-for-all. There was an institutional attempt to regulate the miraculous, to distinguish between genuine divine intervention and human error, fraud, or even illusion caused by the devil. This formal process, though perhaps slow and subject to bias, shows that there was an awareness that not every strange event was necessarily holy. They had a protocol, even if it wasn't quite CSI Medieval Abbey. You perhaps encounter one of these official investigators. He might be a stern-faced cleric, less interested in your personal feelings of awe and more in precise details. You say you heard a sound near the reliquary of St. Pancras. Describe it exactly. What time of day was it? Who else was present? Was the wind blowing? Had you consumed any fermented beverages prior to the experience? Your earnest description of a heart-stopping groan might be met with a calm, almost dismissive, "Many old buildings settle, my son. Are you certain it emanated from the reliquary itself and not merely near it?" This is the church trying to be the gatekeeper, sifting through popular reports for what they deem genuinely significant. The outcomes of these investigations could vary. In some cases, the reports might be officially sanctioned, adding to the lore and reputation of the shrine. the sounds would be declared a genuine sign of the saint's power, integrated into the shrine's official narrative, perhaps even cited in documents or chronicles. This validation was crucial. It turned a pilgrim's personal experience into an institutional truth. It's like your friend telling you they saw a UFO, and then the government releases a statement saying, yes, unexplained aerial phenomena exist. Suddenly, your friend's story has official backing. In other cases, the investigation might be inconclusive. The sounds persisted, witnesses remained convinced, but the investigators couldn't find definitive proof or a satisfactory natural explanation, nor did they feel comfortable giving it official miraculous status. The reports might simply be left in a sort of theological limbo, neither confirmed nor denied, allowing local belief to continue while the church maintained plausible deniability or simply filed it under mysterious. And then there were the cases where the reports were quietly or even explicitly dismissed. Perhaps the investigators found a clear natural cause, an obvious draft, a structural issue, or maybe even detected something suspicious about the monks guarding the relic. Or perhaps the reports were deemed too far-fetched, the witnesses unreliable, or the phenomenon inconsistent with church teaching. In these instances, the official line would be that the sounds were either natural, imagined, or possibly even a trick of the devil designed to mislead the faithful. This dismissal wasn't always publicly announced with great fanfare. Sometimes it was a quiet instruction to the local clergy to discourage such talk. You wouldn't want to spook the pilgrims, after all, just manage their expectations. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to these investigations is that sometimes the lack of sound was seen as significant. If a notorious sinner approached the reliquary and it didn't groan or vibrate, as it was claimed to do for others, this might be interpreted not as disproving the phenomenon, but as a sign that the saint was refusing to acknowledge or engage with such a person. Or conversely, if a particularly saintly individual approached and the relic remained silent, perhaps it meant the saint was at peace in their presence. The absence of the expected could be reinterpreted to fit the narrative, a clever piece of theological gymnastics. It didn't scream. A profound silence, a different kind of miracle. Historians still argue whether the church's investigations into miracles and relic phenomena were primarily driven by a genuine desire to discern truth, a need to control popular piety and prevent heresy or superstition, or simply practical concerns like managing the reputation and income of important shrines. Was the system designed to find miracles or to regulate them? Was the skepticism of investigators genuine intellectual curiosity, or a calculated move to maintain authority by only endorsing phenomena that serve the church's purpose? It's a complex question, reflecting the multifaceted role of the church in medieval society. Spiritual guide, temporal power, and major economic institution all rolled into one. You hearing about these official inquiries might feel a mixture of relief and cynicism. A relief that there was some attempt at vetting these wild claims, that it wasn't just a free-for-all of supernatural marketing. Cynicism because you suspect that the outcome of the investigation might have been influenced less by the objective truth of the sounds and more by what was politically or economically convenient for the church at the time. Did the bishop want this shrine to be more famous? Did the abbot need more visitors to fund that new wing of the monastery? These mundane concerns weren't separate from the spiritual ones. They were deeply intertwined. Imagine yourself watching one of these investigators at work. He kneels by the reliquary, his head cocked, listening intently. He closes his eyes, trying to filter out the sounds of the bustling church. Does he hear anything? Or is he already formulating his report in his head based on interviews and prevailing opinions? The actual sounds almost secondary to the narrative that is expected or desired. It's a reminder that even official processes can be swayed by context, expectation, and human agendas. The official blessing of a relic's voice wasn't just a confirmation of a miracle. It was a powerful tool. It validated the faith of the pilgrims, elevated the status of the saint and the shrine, and reinforced the authority of the clergy who served as intermediaries to such potent spiritual forces. It drew lines between acceptable belief and potentially problematic superstition, ensuring that piety remained within approved channels. So, while you might hear hushed debates among the monks and investigators, once the official word was out, whether accepting or dismissing the phenomenon, that became the sanctioned reality for the masses. You either believed the church's interpretation, or you kept your dissenting opinions very, very quiet. So the official church machine had its gears turning, investigating these claims, sifting through the reports you'd heard whispered among the pilgrims. But what exactly were these sounds that people were claiming to perceive? It wasn't just a generic noise. Pilgrims and monks alike often categorized the sounds, giving them specific names and, crucially, specific spiritual meanings. It was like having a divine dictionary where each syllable, each resonance, had a defined theological purpose. You start listening more critically now, trying to discern not just if you hear something, but what it is. Is that creak the building settling, or is it something else? And if it's something else, what kind of something else? The common descriptions you hear circulating among the faithful here at the shrine fall into a few key categories, each loaded with interpretation. There were the groans. These were often described as deep, sorrowful sounds, heavy with the weight of suffering. If you heard a groan, the prevailing interpretation was that the saint was lamenting the sins of the world, or perhaps the particular sins of someone nearby, maybe your sins, which isn't exactly a confidence booster. A loud, resonant groan might signify the saint's deep displeasure or anguish over a major heresy or a pending disaster like a plague or invasion. It was the sound of divine empathy, or maybe divine exasperation, depending on your level of personal guilt. It was like the saint was letting out a big cosmic, "Look at these humans messing things up again." Then there were the sighs. These were softer, breathier sounds. A weary sigh could still denote sadness at human folly, but perhaps a more gentle, resigned sadness. A soft, almost inaudible sigh might be interpreted as the saint's presence being felt, a quiet acknowledgement or a gentle breath of comfort. It was less about judgment and more about a sort of spiritual exhalation, a subtle presence making itself known. Think of it like someone you love sitting quietly next to you, and you just hear their soft breathing, comforting, present, not demanding attention, but deeply felt. A gentle sigh could reassure pilgrims that the saint was listening. Even if they weren't shouting their miracles from the rooftops, the whispers were perhaps the most intriguing and the most open to personal interpretation. These were said to be faint, sometimes indistinct sounds, like voices just at the edge of hearing. They could be interpreted as the saint offering guidance, warnings, or even prophecies. The ambiguity of a whisper was its power. It allowed pilgrims and clergy alike to project meaning onto it. Was it a warning about a specific person? A cryptic instruction for the abbot? Or perhaps just the wind whistling through a crack? Trying to decipher a divine whisper in a drafty stone building sounds like the world's most frustrating game of telephone, doesn't it? Was that repent, the end is nigh, or recent, mend, pi, high? You can see how interpretations might diverge. More dramatic sounds included cries or wails. These were much rarer and often associated with moments of intense crisis or the presence of someone deemed truly wicked or possessed. A saint crying out was seen as a powerful expression of spiritual agony, perhaps even a struggle against demonic forces trying to infiltrate the sacred space. If you heard this, you probably didn't stick around asking questions. You likely fell to your knees in terror or awe. It was the sonic equivalent of a spiritual air raid siren. Something is very, very wrong. Beyond auditory phenomena, there were reports of physical sensations, vibrations, or tremors emanating from the reliquary itself. This wasn't just a sound, it was felt. This could be interpreted as the saint stirring, restless power radiating outwards, or perhaps a physical reaction to significant spiritual energy, positive or negative, in the vicinity. Imagine placing your hand near the reliquary and feeling a distinct hum or tremor. Pretty convincing stuff, right? Even if it was just the building's natural vibrations or something else, the feeling of it could be profoundly impactful. Then there were the sounds that defied easy categorization. The truly quirky reports. Some might claim to hear a faint humming, like distant chanting, suggesting a connection to heavenly choirs. Others might report a distinct clicking or rattling sound, interpreted as the bones within the reliquary shifting, a sign of the saint's dynamic, living presence, even in death. One particularly memorable and perhaps dubious account I read mentioned a relic that allegedly made a sound like a cat sneezing when certain bishops came near. What that was supposed to mean spiritually is anyone's guess, but it certainly falls into the fringe tidbit category. Perhaps the saint just wasn't a cat person, even in the afterlife. A quirky or fringe tidbit you learn here is that the absence of a sound could also be interpreted significantly. If the relic was known to groan when sinners approached, but remained silent when a particularly devout person knelt before it, this wasn't seen as the phenomenon failing. Instead, it was interpreted as the saint being at peace or approving of the person's piety. Conversely, if someone expected the relic to react to their great suffering or devotion and it remained silent, it might lead to soul searching. Was their faith insufficient? Was the saint ignoring them? The silence could be as heavy with potential meaning as any sound. It was like Schrodinger's relic. It was both noisy and silent depending on who was observing it and how you chose to interpret the non-event. The interpretation of these sounds wasn't left entirely up to individual pilgrims like you, wandering around hoping to catch a divine whisper. The local clergy, the monks who lived and breathed the atmosphere of the abbey, played a crucial role in guiding and standardizing these interpretations. They would preach about the meanings of the sounds, share authenticated accounts, and gently or not so gently, correct interpretations that strayed too far from the accepted narrative. If you claimed you heard the relic humming a popular drinking song, they'd probably guide you towards the heavenly choir's interpretation instead, perhaps while suggesting you spend less time in the tavern and more in prayer. This practice of categorizing and interpreting sounds wasn't unique to relics. It was part of a broader medieval mindset that sought spiritual meaning in natural phenomena. Omens in the sky, unusual animal behavior, strange dreams, all were seen as potential messages from the divine or demonic realms, requiring careful interpretation by those with the appropriate knowledge, usually the clergy. A mainstream historical fact is that the medieval world was deeply symbolic, viewing the physical world as a reflection of the spiritual realm. Events, objects, and even sounds were not just physical phenomena, but potential signs loaded with theological significance. This applied to everything from the flight of birds to the groans from a saint's skull. Historians still argue whether this elaborate taxonomy of relic sounds and their interpretations arose organically from genuinely perceived, though perhaps naturally caused, phenomena being filtered through a pious worldview, or if it was largely constructed and promoted by the church hierarchy and local clergy to enhance the spiritual power and prestige of specific shrines. Was it genuine belief shaping perception, or was it carefully managed messaging shaping belief? Was the pilgrim honestly hearing a groan and then seeking an interpretation? Or were they told the saint groans when sinners are near, and thus hearing a groan when they felt sinful or saw someone who looked the part? It's tough to untangle the threads of faith, psychology, and institutional interest centuries later. As you stand near the reliquary, straining your ears, you are acutely aware of this. Are you hoping to hear something? Are you afraid to hear something, especially a groan that might indict you? Are you listening for a specific type of sound based on what you have been told? Your own perception is now layered with anticipation, fear, hope, and the weight of collective expectation. You might hear a faint sound, maybe a sigh, or was it just the wind again? You pause, listen harder. If you decide it was a sign, what does that mean? You cast your mind back to the sermons you've heard, the whispered explanations. A psalm. The saint's presence. Gentle comfort, perhaps? Yes, that feels right. That feels reassuring. See how quickly the interpretation fits the potential sound? It's a powerful feedback loop between expectation, perception, and instilled meaning. It's like when you're alone in an old house and every creak sounds like a ghost. You're primed to interpret ambiguity in a specific, spooky way. The clergy here likely had a ready explanation for almost any sound, or lack thereof. A faint tapping, the saint knocking on the door of heaven for you. A low hum, the resonance of piety filling the space. A sudden silence after noise, the saint holding their breath in anticipation, or perhaps respectfully silent in the presence of profound faith, or profound hypocrisy. Again, depends on who's standing there. This flexibility of interpretation ensured that whatever actual acoustic phenomena occurred, or didn't occur, they could be seamlessly integrated into the ongoing narrative of the saint's active power. It made the relic, quite literally, a living, breathing entity in the eyes of the faithful, constantly communicating, constantly relevant. Your experience as a pilgrim is shaped by this. You came seeking a connection, a miracle or peace. The sounds and their ascribed meanings provided a tangible way to feel that connection, to believe the saint was active on your behalf or at least aware of your presence. You might leave the shrine not just with a sense of having been in a holy place, but with a specific memory. I heard the saint sigh, or I felt the relic vibrate, a sign of its power. These sounds became personal, physical proof for the pilgrim, reinforced by the communal understanding and the official interpretations provided by the church. It was a multisensory, collectively interpreted spiritual experience, all centered around whatever noises an old box of bones might or might not be making in a drafty stone building. And you were right there, straining your ears, hoping to catch a sound that would give meaning to your journey. You've spent time now, ears straining, trying to categorize the potential sounds, leaning into the medieval mindset that saw spiritual significance everywhere. But even in the Middle Ages, not everyone was ready to attribute every creak and groan directly to a saint lamenting human sin or a relic battling demons. There were always more pragmatic minds, people who looked for explanations closer to the ground, literally and figuratively. And as you stand there waiting for that divine whisper or resonant sigh, a different part of your modern brain starts to engage, nudging you towards less miraculous possibilities. Think about the environment you're in, a large old stone building, probably drafty, made of materials that expand and contract with temperature changes, built centuries ago, likely settling and shifting over time. These are not silent environment units. You know from spending time in old houses or even just listening to your own home at night that buildings make noises. They creak, they groan, sound familiar. They tick, they settle. The wind whistles through gaps, floorboards protest underfoot. The heating system, if you have one, they certainly didn't then, but you get the idea, might make odd noises. Apply that reality to a massive stone abbey built in the Dark Ages, and you've got a symphony of potential sounds that have nothing to do with celestial goings-on. So one very obvious, very non-miraculous explanation for some of the alleged sounds coming from relics or their surroundings is simply the acoustics and structural noises of the building itself. A reliquary chamber might be small and enclosed, acting as a resonant box. Sounds from elsewhere in the abbey, chanting monks, doors closing, wind outside, even someone coughing in the nave, could echo, distort, and travel in unexpected ways, sounding like they originated from the sacred object. The heavy wooden or stone reliquary itself, perhaps built into a wall or altar, could pick up vibrations from the structure. A subtle tremor in the foundation, maybe due to nearby activity or just geological settling, could manifest as a faint vibration emanating from the reliquary. The expansion and contraction of stone and wood due to changes in temperature or humidity could easily produce groans, clicks, and creaks, especially in the cool, damp environment often found in crypts or chapels housing relics. Imagine a sudden cold snap outside causing the stone to contract ever so slightly. Creak. There's your saintly groan, courtesy of basic physics. Then there are the very biological inhabitants of old buildings. Rats, mice, birds, even large insects can make noises. Scuttling sounds, squeaks, wing beats, or rustling can be amplified in quiet spaces, especially at night. A rat gnawing near a reliquary could easily be misinterpreted as a mysterious tapping or scratching. Birds nesting in the eaves above might cause faint sounds that seem to emanate from the ceiling near an elevated relic. This isn't exactly glamorous, is it? Yes, I traveled for 3 months to hear the sacred relic, and it sounds suspiciously like a mouse convention. Not great for pilgrimage marketing, but it's a perfectly plausible explanation for some reports of faint, inexplicable noises. Environmental factors like wind are also major culprits. Drafts whistling through cracks in walls or windows can produce eerie sounds, especially in stone buildings with uneven surfaces that create complex air currents. A strong gust could sound like a sigh or even a low moan as it passes through an aperture near the reliquary. Changes in atmospheric pressure, though perhaps a more modern concept to explain subtle building noises, can also contribute to slight shifts in sounds and structures. Imagine the wind outside picking up, swirling around the abbey, and funneling through a small vent near the relic chest, producing a low hum or a whistling sound. To a mind primed for the miraculous, that's not just wind, that's the voice of the saint. Beyond the purely physical building and environment, there are the psychological and physiological factors of the human listeners themselves. Pilgrims arriving after a long, arduous journey were often exhausted, emotionally heightened, and desperately seeking spiritual affirmation or healing. In such a state, the brain can be more susceptible to suggestion and misinterpretation. Tinnitus, a common condition causing ringing or buzzing in the ears, could contribute to perceived sounds, especially in silent or near-silent environments. Auditory hallucinations, while often associated with medical conditions, can also occur in states of extreme fatigue, stress, or emotional intensity. More subtly, there's the power of suggestion and expectation. If you've been told the saint's relic groans when a sinner is near, you are primed to hear a groan whenever you feel guilty or see someone you disapprove of. This isn't deliberate lying, it's the brain making sense of ambiguous sensory input based on prior information. It's like the classic example of hearing your name called in a crowded room. Your brain filters the noise and picks out what it's expecting to hear. In the quiet, expectant atmosphere of a reliquary chapel, every creak, every draft, every internal body noise, like your own heartbeat in your ears, could be interpreted through the lens of the expected saintly sounds. This is a mainstream historical fact. Human perception is highly subjective and influenced by context, belief, and expectation. Then there's mass suggestion or collective hallucination. When multiple people are gathered in a highly charged emotional state, sharing the same beliefs and expectations, the power of suggestion can amplify individual perceptions. One person reporting a faint sound can make others listen harder and hear similar things, even if there is no external source. This isn't to say people were faking it. They genuinely believed they heard the sounds, their perception shaped by the collective experience and the powerful spiritual narrative surrounding the relic. Think of how contagious yawning is, or how easily panic can spread in a crowd. Human brains are wired to synchronize and influence each other, and this applies to sensory interpretation too. A quirky or fringe tidbit about this era, though maybe less directly tied to relics than to broader spiritual phenomena, is the concept of spectral evidence, used during witch trials centuries later. While not about sounds from objects, it highlights the medieval and early modern willingness to accept subjective, uncorroborated sensory experiences, like seeing a witch's spirit, as concrete proof in a court of law. This same acceptance of subjective sensory input applied to relic sounds. Your claim to have heard the saint sigh might be taken as spiritual fact, not questioned as potential misinterpretation or hallucination. It wasn't about proving the physical reality of the sound beyond doubt. It was about accepting the spiritual reality it represented based on the pilgrim's testimony. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of these relic sounds was primarily due to these natural and psychological factors being misinterpreted, or if there was a significant element of deliberate fabrication or exaggeration, perhaps by the clergy or shrine custodians seeking to enhance the relic's fame and draw more pilgrims and their donations. Was it mostly honest misperception, Or was there a conscious effort to encourage these claims? It's incredibly difficult to disentangle genuine belief from deliberate deception or subconscious bias centuries after the fact, especially with sources often written by those with a vested interest in promoting the miraculous nature of the shrine. You consider this as you listen. Is that faint scraping sound the saint sharpening something? Or is it just a beetle somewhere? Is that low hum the resonance of holiness? Or is it just the wind hitting the corner of the building? Your mind, armed with modern knowledge of acoustics, psychology, and creepy old building noises, offers alternative explanations for every potential sound. That groan you thought you heard earlier, maybe it was the ancient timbers settling under a slight change in temperature. That feeling of vibration, perhaps just your own pulse felt in your fingertips as you lean on the stone base of the reliquary, or the rumble of a distant cart outside the abbey walls. It's almost disappointing, isn't it? The idea that the awe-inspiring, potentially miraculous sounds of a saint might just be the spiritual equivalent of your house making weird noises at 3 a.m. Ah, yes, the blessed St. Cuthbert's relic is groaning again. Sounds like the downstairs bathroom pipes. Takes a bit of the mystery out of it. But for many people, particularly those predisposed to faith and eager for signs, these natural sounds, when filtered through belief and expectation, became undeniable proof of the saint's active presence. They weren't listening for any sound, they were listening for a meaningful sound, and their brains were ready to find it. Even if the source was natural, the effect was spiritual. A pilgrim who heard what they believed to be a saintly sigh might leave with a profound sense of peace and reassurance. Someone who heard a groan might be spurred to greater penance. The power wasn't just in the sound itself, but in its interpretation and the spiritual impact it had on the believer. The building's acoustics, the local wildlife, the wind, the human ear's quirks, all could unintentionally serve as instruments in a grand, divinely interpreted symphony, leading people closer to what they perceived as the sacred. It's a fascinating interplay between the mundane physical world and the transcendent spiritual beliefs layered upon it. The story of these relic sounds isn't just about whether the bones actually made noise in a way we'd understand physically. It's about how sound, or the perception of sound, became a catalyst for spiritual experience, reinforced by community belief and institutional interpretation. And as you stand there trying to separate the rustling of your robes from a potential divine whisper, you realize just how complex that process was, and how easily your own senses could be fooled by expectation in such a potent, atmospheric place. Maybe that was part of the point all along. You've just been contemplating how easily creaks, drafts, and even your own heartbeat could be interpreted as saintly sighs and groans, especially in the quiet, charged atmosphere of a medieval reliquary chapel. Your brain eager to find the sacred in the mundane. It makes a lot of sense, right? The acoustics are weird, the building is ancient, and your mind is half asleep and completely suggestible after days or weeks on the road. But even then, when belief in the miraculous was arguably much more widespread and deeply embedded in daily life than it is today, did everyone buy it? Were there people, even back in the Middle Ages, who heard about these screaming relics and thought, yeah, nah, I reckon someone's pulling a fast one, or maybe just sounds like rats, honestly? Spoiler alert, yes, skepticism isn't exclusively a modern invention. While the form of skepticism changes, medieval doubt wouldn't be based on germ theory or neurobiology, obviously. The basic human capacity to question unusual claims has always been around. You can imagine it, can't you? Old man Thomas down the lane, who's seen a few too many miracles turn out to be elaborate hoaxes or simple misunderstandings, hearing about the bleeding host or the groaning bone and just raising a cynical eyebrow. He might not have a scientific explanation, but he has the evidence of his own life experience, which tells him that extraordinary claims require, well, more than just Sister Agnes saying she heard it again. So while the official narratives often emphasize the unwavering faith of the Pilgrims and the undeniable power of the relics, the reality was almost certainly more nuanced. There were likely varying degrees of belief, from absolute conviction to polite acceptance to outright disbelief, depending on the individual, their education, their personal experiences, and maybe just whether they'd had a good night's sleep before hearing the story. It's easy to paint the Middle Ages with a broad brush of everyone believed everything the church said, but that wasn't strictly true. People negotiated their faith and their understanding of the world in complex ways. Consider the authorities themselves. The church, while promoting relics and pilgrimages as crucial aspects of medieval piety, and let's be honest, significant sources of income and prestige for many institutions, also had a vested interest in maintaining order and preventing outright fraud or potentially heretical interpretations. They couldn't just have anybody claiming their teapot was weeping holy water or their garden gnome was groaning with divine wisdom. There were procedures, albeit not always strictly enforced or universally applied, for authenticating relics and investigating alleged miracles. This is a mainstream historical fact. The church developed processes, sometimes quite rigorous for their time, to verify the authenticity of relics and reported miracles, often involving interviews with witnesses, background checks on the claimant, and examinations of the object itself, though their methods might seem quaint to us today. Think of papal bulls, episcopal visitations, and councils discussing criteria for sainthood, all part of an effort to control the narrative and legitimacy surrounding the miraculous. So if reports of a relic groaning started getting out of hand, or if there were rival shrines competing for pilgrims and one accused the other of faking its sounds, you can bet there might be some official scrutiny. A bishop might send representatives to investigate. They'd interview the monks or canons guarding the relic, interview pilgrims, perhaps even spend time listening themselves. If the sounds were suspiciously regular, or only happened when certain people were present, or if the custodians seemed overly eager to demonstrate the phenomenon, that might raise red flags even for a medieval investigator. They might not conclude, it's just the wind, but they might conclude, this seems less like divine intervention and more like, something a bit fishy. Well, or maybe they just declared it not a miracle for theological reasons, or because it didn't fit the approved narrative for that particular saint. Imagine the pressure on the custodians, too. If your abbey had the jawbone of St. Flibbertigibbet, and rumors were spreading that it occasionally emitted a low moan as a warning against pride, you'd probably be inclined to encourage that belief, wouldn't you? Draws in the crowds, boosts the donation box. But you'd also know that if someone important came to investigate and heard nothing, or worse, noticed Brother Cuthbert making strange ventriloquist noises from behind the altar cloth, you'd be in serious trouble. So there was a delicate line to walk between promoting the miraculous and avoiding accusations of outright deception. Historians still argue whether the primary driver of reports like these was genuine, if misinterpreted, sensory experience, or if there was a significant element of deliberate, albeit piously intended fraud on the part of shrine custodians or others. It's tough to know centuries later who was genuinely convinced, who was playing along, and who was actively deceiving. Then there were the secular authorities, kings, dukes, local lords. They also had interests tied up in these shrines. Pilgrimages brought wealth and people into their territories. But sometimes powerful abbeys or churches were rivals to secular power. A lord might look upon a famous, sound-emitting relic less as a source of spiritual awe and more as the reason Abbot Boniface was getting too rich and influential. They might be less inclined to accept miraculous claims uncritically, especially if it served their political purposes to cast doubt on the institution promoting them. Beyond the officials, there were simply people whose lived experience made them skeptical. Someone who worked with acoustics, maybe a builder or architect involved in constructing or repairing churches, might have a better understanding than most of how sound behaves in large stone buildings. They might hear a story about a groaning pillar and think, yeah, sounds like that bit of settling we noticed near the apse last year. Someone who traveled widely might have seen rival shrines make similar, contradictory claims, leading them to question the veracity of all of them. Oh, this church says their relic groans when sinners are present. Well, the one in the next town claims theirs sings when a saint walks by him. Can they both be right? Doubt creeps in, even without a scientific framework. A quirky or fringe tidbit illustrating this point, though again not directly about relics, comes from the late medieval period. specifically during times of intense religious fervor or social upheaval. There are scattered accounts, often from skeptical chroniclers or later reformers, of alleged miracles that were exposed as deliberate hoaxes. One persistent rumor, bordering on urban legend, involves statues of saints or the Virgin Mary that were rigged with mechanisms to appear to weep or move, sometimes even speak via hidden assistance or early ventriloquism. While hard proof is scarce, and many such stories were likely propaganda from those seeking to discredit relic veneration, the existence of these stories suggests that the idea of religious fraud was not unthinkable in the medieval mind. People knew trickery was possible, and some were on the lookout for it. It wasn't all wide-eyed credulity. Think about it from your modern perspective. If you heard a news report tomorrow that a famous historical artifact in a museum had started making strange noises, your first thought probably wouldn't be, "Oh, it must be possessed," or, "Wow, the spirit of the craftsman is lamenting its conservation status." Your mind would immediately go to practical explanations: faulty HVAC system, vibrations from nearby construction, rats, structural settling, maybe even someone playing a prank. You are, by default, approaching it with a degree of modern skepticism informed by science and technology. While a medieval person didn't have the same tools, they still had pattern recognition, common sense, to a degree, and the understanding that humans sometimes lie or are mistaken. So as you stand there straining your ears, trying to discern divine lamentation from environmental noise, you also remember the human element. The fervent believers, yes, but also the quiet doubters, the pragmatic custodians worried about their reputation, the cynical lords and the church officials trying to keep a lid on things. It wasn't just a passive reception of miraculous claims. It was an active negotiation of belief, where claims were made, interpreted, accepted, questioned, and sometimes subtly or overtly doubted. The sounds, whether real or imagined, natural or manipulated, were filtered through this complex social and religious landscape. A pilgrim's tearful testimony of a groan might be celebrated at one shrine and dismissed as overactive imagination, or even outright fraud by a rival one. The official stance on a particular sound might change depending on who was in charge of the abbey or the diocese. It wasn't a static picture of universal credulity. It was a dynamic environment where faith, hope, economic interest, political power, and yes, even medieval forms of skepticism all played a part. It's kind of reassuring, isn't it? Knowing that even then some folks were probably muttering under their breath about all that racket coming from the reliquary again, and wondering if maybe someone just needed to check the foundation, or maybe lay some traps for mice. It grounds the story a little, makes it feel less like a completely alien mindset and more like, well, people being people, trying to make sense of strange sounds in a world that readily attributed significance to everything, but wasn't entirely blind to the possibility of more earthly explanations, or even just outright fibs. So you listen, with your modern ears, your modern brain filled with possibilities from settling stone to psychological bias to outright fraud. And you know that somewhere in the shadows of the past, other people listened too, perhaps with different frameworks, but with that same fundamental human capacity to hear something strange and wonder, is that really, or is it just? So you're standing there, remember, amidst the hushed reverence in the thick air of incense, looking at this incredibly important object, this reliquary holding a piece of somebody saintly. You've traveled maybe weeks, maybe months. Your expectations are sky high. You're practically vibrating with a mix of exhaustion and fervent hope. It's the perfect environment for something to happen. And happen it did, at least according to the whispers that started circulating, growing louder, finding their way from hushed conversations in pilgrim hostels to the written pages of chroniclers. It wasn't always the straightforward, expected miracle, the lame walking, the blind seeing. Sometimes it was something far stranger, something that pricked at the edges of comfortable belief, something that introduced a note of disquiet into the holy atmosphere. And among the most unnerving of these stories, the one that seems almost too strange, even for the medieval world, was the persistent rumor that sometimes, from the reliquary or from the very presence of the relic, came sounds. Not holy music, not heavenly choirs, but something else entirely. The sound that pilgrims and later chroniclers started talking about was a scream. Imagine that for a second. You're there praying, perhaps tears in your eyes, feeling the weight of your sins and your hopes, and then cutting through the quiet reverence, a sound. Not necessarily loud, maybe faint, almost like it's coming from a long way off, or from inside the stone walls, or even from the golden box itself. A sound of distress, a scream. What do you do? Do you look around? Do you tell the monk attending the shrine? Do you just blink, shake your head, and assume you imagined it? Or do you start whispering to the person next to you, did you hear that? These weren't isolated incidents, according to the accounts. These were reports that, over time, began to coalesce into a specific type of strange occurrence associated with certain relics or certain shrines. The stories weren't always detailed. Sometimes it was just a mention of strange noises or sounds of lamentation. But the idea of screams, sharp, sudden, or prolonged and faint, was a recurring motif. It was unsettling because it didn't fit the narrative. Relics were supposed to bring comfort, healing, proof of divine grace. What could possibly be screaming? Were they the souls in purgatory crying out for prayers? Was it a demon, tormented by the holy presence? Or was it the saint themselves, somehow still capable of experiencing such raw emotion through their earthly remains? The medieval mind had a lot of potential answers, none of them particularly relaxing before bedtime. Now, how do these stories spread? In the medieval world, long before the internet, obviously, mass media, yes, nope, or even reliable postal services for everyone, definitely not, information, especially juicy, slightly scandalous, or miraculous information, traveled primarily by mouth. Pilgrims were the original social media influencers. You walked for months, you met hundreds, maybe thousands of people on the road, in hostels, at the shrine itself. You shared stories, stories of the journey, stories of your hopes, and stories of what you saw or heard. Imagine arriving back in your home village after a pilgrimage to, say, Santiago de Compostela. The entire village would gather around. Tell us, they'd say. You talk about the hardships of the road, the beautiful cathedrals, the feeling of finally reaching the shrine, and then perhaps, in a hushed voice, leaning closer, you'd say, and up at the reliquary of St. James, and they say, sometimes you can hear a sound, and then you describe it, the faint cry, the sudden shriek. Your audience would gasp. They'd retell your story to their neighbors, who'd tell their cousins in the next village. The story morphs a little with each telling, gains a bit more drama, maybe specifics are added. It happened on the feast day, or it only happens at midnight. Beyond the direct pilgrim to villager network, you also had merchants crisscrossing Europe, carrying not just goods, but gossip and news. Monks traveling between monasteries, spreading word of spiritual matters, including miraculous or perplexing events at various abbeys. Soldiers, messengers, jongleurs, anyone who moved around became a node in this vast organic information network. A quirky or fringe tidbit here is that pilgrimage routes themselves became the arteries not just for faith, but for cultural exchange, trade, and the rapid, relatively speaking, spread of both factual information and spectacular rumor. The Camino de Santiago, the routes to Rome, to the Holy Land, or to local shrines, these weren't just paths on a map, they were dynamic communication channels, buzzing with chatter, rumor, and shared experience. It was like Twitter, but slower, smellier, and involving way more blisters. But oral transmission is fluid. Stories change, details get fuzzy. For a rumor to gain more permanence, to become part of the accepted lore surrounding a shrine or a relic, it needed to be written down. This is where the chroniclers, historians, and hagiographers, writers of saints' lives, come in. These were the people who, for various reasons, to record history, to promote a shrine, to provide moral examples, or simply because they were fascinated by unusual events, compiled accounts of miracles and other noteworthy occurrences. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval chronicles and collections of miracles, known as libri miraculorum, are invaluable, though often challenging, sources for understanding medieval beliefs, society, and even events. Monasteries often kept records of the miracles reported at their shrines. Bishops might commission accounts. Traveling scholars or writers, encountering pilgrims, might interview them and record their stories. These written accounts serve to legitimize the stories, to fix them more or less in a specific form, and to broadcast them to a wider literate audience, primarily other clergy, nobility, and scholars, but eventually influencing the narratives told to the general populace. Imagine a monk sitting in a scriptorium, quill in hand. A pilgrim has just been interviewed, breathless with the story of the strange sound they heard emanating from the reliquary. The monk listens, perhaps with a raised eyebrow, perhaps with pious awe. He starts writing. Item, it is reported by a pious pilgrim recently returned from shrine name, that whilst engaged in fervent prayer before the sacred bones of Saint's name, he did perceive a sound, not of this world, like unto a cry of human distress, issuing forth from the reliquary itself. Many others present did likewise attest to hearing similar sounds. The monk might add his own interpretation. Was it a sign of the saint's suffering? A warning? A struggle against unseen forces? The act of writing this down takes the fleeting oral account and gives it weight, makes it official, part of the historical record, at least from a medieval perspective. Why would chroniclers include such strange, even potentially off-putting stories like screams? Well, medieval people were fascinated by the supernatural in all its forms, not just the comforting kind. Unusual events were seen as signs, portents, or interactions with the spiritual realm, whether divine or demonic. A screaming relic, while disturbing, was arguably more proof of its active spiritual power than a silent one. It showed the relic wasn't just old bones in a box. It was a focal point for intense spiritual energy, perhaps even a battleground between good and evil. Plus, let's be honest, weird stories make for more interesting reading, even back then. Local Relic sits quietly probably wasn't a bestseller. Local Relic screams at people. Now that's got legs, pun intended, considering we're talking about bones. These written accounts, once copied and circulated, added another layer to the story's spread. A pilgrim who didn't hear the scream might read about it in a liber miraculorum at another monastery and then return home reporting, oh yes, everyone knows the relic of Saint so-and-so screams. The written word could reinforce, expand upon, or even distort the original oral tradition. It created a feedback loop where the written record influenced future oral accounts and vice versa. This propagation of these strange rumors, specifically of screams, highlights the complex interplay between popular belief, individual experience, or perceived experience, and the efforts of the literate elite to document and interpret these phenomena. It also raises questions about suggestibility. If you arrive at a shrine where you've heard there are strange sounds, are you more likely to interpret an ordinary creak, a gust of wind through a gap, or even a ringing in your ears, maybe from that questionable tavern wine you had last night, as the legendary scream? Very possibly. The power of expectation in shaping perception is a timeless human trait. And this brings us to a point where scholars still grapple with the nuances. Historians still argue whether the recording of these bizarre phenomena, like screaming relics in medieval chronicles, reflects genuine, from the perspective of the time, spiritual occurrences, mass hysteria, intentional fabrication to enhance a shrine's reputation, or simply a medieval fascination with the uncanny that led them to record any strange report without much critical filtering. It's hard for us, looking back through centuries of different worldviews, to untangle belief from deliberate deception or shared delusion from what was simply accepted as part of the mysterious way the divine and demonic realms interacted with the physical world. Whatever the ultimate explanation, and we'll delve into some possibilities later if you're still awake, the key takeaway here is that the idea of relics making sounds, specifically cries or screams, was a real phenomenon in the sense that it was reported by people, recorded by writers, and became part of the folklore surrounding certain holy sites. It wasn't just a one-off weirdo hearing things. It was a recurring narrative that found traction in the medieval imagination. It introduces a genuinely eerie element into the veneration of these objects. What if they weren't just passively receiving prayers, but were somehow actively reacting, perhaps even suffering, in their sacred containment? Imagine the conversations late at night in the Pilgrim dormitory. Tired travelers huddled around a flickering lamp, sharing stories of the road. Someone mentions the scream, others chime in, "Oh yes, I've heard that too at St. Cuthbert's." Or, "My cousin told me that at the shrine of St. Ursula's Virgins." The stories would build upon each other, creating a collective sense of unease and wonder. It was like a medieval creepypasta, passed from person to person, gaining power and detail with every retelling. The very act of telling and retelling these stories embedded them deeper into the cultural consciousness. They weren't just side notes. For some pilgrims, hearing or hoping to hear the scream might have become part of the pilgrimage experience itself, another sign that this was a truly potent and miraculous place, even if the miracle was a disturbing one. It added a layer of mystery and even a frisson of fear to the devotion. It was a reminder that the sacred could also be unsettling, that contact with the divine, or whatever was causing the sound, wasn't always comforting. So these whispers, these tales of strange sounds, specifically screams, were not just isolated oddities. They were a documented, if perplexing, aspect of medieval relic veneration. They spread through the vital network of pilgrims and travelers and gained weight and permanence through the written records of chroniclers. They introduced a note of ambiguity and unease into the otherwise straightforward narrative of holy power and miraculous healing. And they set the stage for deeper questions about what exactly people were experiencing or believing they were experiencing when they knelt before those ancient bones and heard something that sounded an awful lot like a cry. Okay, so you've got these stories, these whispers of screams coming from holy relics, circulating through the pilgrim networks and getting written down by chroniclers. It's undeniably creepy, right? It adds this layer of Gothic horror to the otherwise serene picture of saintly veneration. And naturally, people then and now have tried to figure out why. What was going on? Were these stories just made up? Was it something supernatural? Or was there a perfectly mundane explanation that just got twisted through the lens of medieval belief? Let's poke at some of these possibilities, starting with how someone living, say in the 13th century, might have interpreted a screaming relic. Remember, the medieval world was absolutely saturated with belief in the active presence of the spiritual realm. The line between the physical and the metaphysical was much blurrier than it is for most of us today. So if a sound like a scream came from a relic, or near one, the first thought wasn't usually, "must be a draft." It was, what spiritual force is at work here? One common explanation, aligning with the constant medieval struggle against evil, was that the sound was caused by demons. Maybe the demon was trapped within the reliquary, tormented by the holy presence of the saint's remains. It's a bit like a spiritual insect zapper. The holiness attracts and zaps the evil. Or perhaps the demon wasn't trapped in the box, but was external, trying to torment the saint's spirit, or even trying to lure the pilgrims away from their devotion with unsettling noises. Medieval demonology was incredibly detailed. They had demons for everything, from causing bad weather to tempting you with gluttony. A demon specifically assigned to creep pilgrims out at shrines? Totally on brand. The scream, in this interpretation, wasn't a sign of the saint's distress, but the demon's agony or malice. It was, in a twisted way, confirmation of the relic's power. It was so potent, it could make a demon cry out. Another possibility medieval thinkers might consider relates to the souls in purgatory. This was a very real, very pressing concept in the Middle Ages. Souls there were undergoing purification before they could enter heaven, often depicted as a painful process. Could the screams be from these suffering souls, drawn to the holy presence of the saint, perhaps crying out for prayers from the pilgrims to help ease their passage? Pilgrimage itself was often undertaken partly for penance, to reduce time in purgatory for oneself or loved ones. A screaming relic could be a powerful, audible reminder of the need for intercession, a sound intended to spur pilgrims to pray harder, give more alms, and think about the fate of the departed. It turns the shrine into a direct auditory link to the suffering afterlife, which is a delightfully disturbing thought to fall asleep to. And then there's the possibility that the sound was somehow connected to the saint themselves. This is where it gets really strange. Were they suffering through their relics? Was it a cry of empathy for the suffering of the pilgrims praying to them? Or perhaps most unsettlingly, was it a sign that the saint was somehow displeased? Had the shrine fallen into disrepair, or was there some sin being committed nearby that caused the saint's earthly remains to recoil and cry out in spiritual pain or anger? This interpretation would be particularly worrying for the clergy in charge of the shrine. A screaming relic wasn't great for PR if it suggested the saint was unhappy with their management. Imagine trying to explain that to the bishop. Yes, your grace, miracles are happening, but also screaming. We think Saint Widget is mad about the leaky roof. A quirky or fringe tidbit in medieval belief was the idea that sacred objects, places, and even people could be unusually sensitive to sin or impurity. There are stories of consecrated hosts bleeding when approached by someone in a state of mortal sin, or of holy wells drying up if used improperly. A screaming relic could fit into this framework. The saint's remains, radiating holiness, reacting violently to the presence of some profound spiritual corruption nearby. It's the ultimate lie detector, but instead of buzzing, it just lets out a blood-curdling shriek. Beyond the spiritual, could there have been more natural medieval explanations? Not natural in our modern scientific sense, but understandable within their worldview. Perhaps it was interpreted as a form of communication from the divine, a sign or a portent, even if the exact meaning of the scream was unclear. The universe was seen as full of signs, unusual stars, strange animal behavior, visions, and all carrying potential messages from God. A scream from a relic, while frightening, could just be another, albeit very loud and alarming, piece of divine communication. Now let's flip the coin and look at this through a more modern, skeptical lens. When we hear about screaming relics today, our minds immediately jump to a different set of possibilities, ones that don't involve demons or suffering souls. One of the most common modern explanations is suggestibility and mass hysteria. As we touched on before, if a rumor is strong enough, if pilgrims arrive at a shrine expecting to hear strange sounds, their minds can easily interpret ambiguous noises as the legendary scream. The power of collective belief and emotional intensity in a pilgrimage setting can be immense. Put a few hundred tired, emotionally charged, sleep-deprived people in a dimly lit space. Tell them a creepy story, and any creak, groan, gust of wind, or even a stomach rumbling loudly could potentially be perceived and amplified as the scream. Once one person hears it, others might follow suit, influenced by their conviction. It's like seeing shapes in clouds, but with more medieval anxiety. Another possibility is outright fraud or manipulation. The clergy or guardians of a shrine had a vested interest in promoting its holiness and attracting pilgrims. More pilgrims meant more donations, more prestige, more political influence. While many may have been genuinely devout, it's not beyond the realm of possibility that some might have exaggerated reports of miracles or even actively created strange phenomena to enhance the shrine's reputation. A strategically placed reed pipe, a hidden helper, or even just playing on people's expectations could have been used to create the illusion of sound. This doesn't mean every report was fraudulent, of course, but it's a factor that modern historians have to consider. This mainstream historical fact is that relics were big business in the Middle Ages, generating significant income and prestige for the churches and monasteries that housed them, leading to competition and sometimes questionable practices in their acquisition and promotion. Environmental factors are also a strong contender. Older buildings, especially churches and cathedrals, are full of strange noises. Wind whistling through cracks, the settlement of ancient stones, the sounds of animals, birds, bats, rodents, nesting in the walls. Even the acoustics of a large, resonant space could distort ordinary sounds into something unsettling. Maybe it wasn't a scream at all, but a specific atmospheric condition interacting with the architecture that produced an unusual sound, which was then interpreted as a scream by expectant ears. Think about how wind can howl down a chimney and sound vaguely human. Now apply that to a massive, ancient stone building filled with nooks and crannies. Mistranslation or misinterpretation of historical texts is another factor. Medieval Latin or vernaculars can be tricky, and the language used to describe unusual phenomena might not map perfectly onto our modern understanding. A word translated as scream might have originally meant a cry, a wail, or just a strange noise. Similarly, a chronicler writing down a third-hand account might have embellished or slightly altered the original story, adding dramatic elements like a scream where none were present in the initial report. Then there's the simple truth that medieval people had different sensory experiences and different ways of describing them. What they perceived as a scream might not be what we perceive as a scream today. Their auditory environment was also vastly different. Less constant noise, more silence, which might make intermittent, unusual sounds stand out more dramatically. Maybe it was just a monk snoring really loudly in the vestry. This brings us to a point where historians still argue whether the accounts of screaming relics are best understood as evidence of medieval people's fervent belief in the supernatural and their capacity for suggestibility, or if there were occasional genuine, from their perspective, unusual phenomena that were interpreted through the lens of faith and folklore. It's incredibly difficult to retroactively diagnose mass hysteria or definitively prove fraud centuries later. So you're left with this historical puzzle. On one hand, you have numerous accounts from different places and times reporting similar phenomena. On the other, you have a deep understanding of human psychology, the economic incentives surrounding relics, and the natural acoustics of old buildings. Was it all just medieval people being medieval, their imaginations running wild in a world they believed was teeming with spirits? Or were they genuinely experiencing something anomalous, even if it wasn't a literal saint's skeleton shouting? Consider the possibility of auditory hallucinations, either individual or collective, brought on by exhaustion, fasting, common on pilgrimages, stress, or even psychoactive contaminants in food or drink, unlikely to be widespread or consistent enough to explain recurring reports. But hey, never say never in the Middle Ages. A bad batch of ale could make you see things, or hear things, you know? I swear, Father, the Virgin Mary just told me to invest in sheep futures. And the relic? Oh, the relic is judging my life choices audibly. Ultimately, from a modern perspective, while we can't definitively rule out anything, the universe is weird, the most parsimonious explanations tend to lean towards a combination of misinterpretation of natural phenomena, suggestibility within a highly emotional and expectant group setting, and potentially the embellishment or creation of stories for pious or economic reasons. The idea of demons or saintly distress, while fascinating from a historical perspective, doesn't quite fit our current understanding of physics or biology. But that doesn't make the medieval belief any less real or interesting from a historical viewpoint. It tells us volumes about what mattered to them, what frightened them, and how they made sense of a world they perceived as being constantly interacted with by unseen forces. And that perception, that deep-seated belief in the supernatural, is key. It wasn't just that they heard something strange. It was that they believed something strange could and would happen in proximity to powerful holy objects. Their worldview provided the framework for interpreting ambiguous sensory input as miraculous or demonic. If we heard a strange noise in an old church today, our first thought is probably structural, or maybe bats. Their first thought was spiritual. That fundamental difference in worldview is crucial to understanding why stories like Screaming Relics weren't just dismissed as madness, but became part of the accepted, if sometimes unsettling, lore. It's a reminder that history isn't just a list of events, but a deep dive into how people thought and felt about those events, and sometimes how they heard them. So you've considered the medieval explanations, demons, purgatory, saintly displeasure. maybe even a reaction to sin. And the more modern takes, suggestibility, fraud, acoustics, general old building weirdness. Regardless of which explanation feels most plausible to you as you drift off, the undeniable historical fact is that these stories were told. People in the Middle Ages heard about them, wrote them down, and likely debated them just like we are now, albeit with different frameworks. But here's another historical truth. You don't really hear much about screaming relics today, do you? They aren't a major part of modern Catholic tradition or folklore. You don't see pilgrims flocking to a shrine hoping to hear the saint shriek. So what happened? How did a phenomenon, or at least the reports of a phenomenon, that seemed compelling enough to be documented by multiple sources over centuries, just fade away? Well, the world changed. A lot. The intensity of relic veneration peaked in the high and late Middle Ages. Then came the Reformation, which fundamentally challenged the Catholic Church's practices, including the veneration of saints and relics. Protestants often saw relics as superstitious, idolatrous, or even fraudulent. While Catholicism retained its focus on saints, the way relics were viewed and promoted shifted. The raw, almost visceral connection to the saint's physical remains, which sometimes led to these wild stories, became perhaps a little more sanitized or less emphasized in the face of critique. The Counter-Reformation, while reaffirming the importance of relics, also brought a greater emphasis on authenticity and less tolerance for potentially sensational or questionable claims that might give critics ammunition. Beyond the religious shifts, the Enlightenment dawned. Reason, science, and empirical observation began to chip away at the medieval worldview, where the spiritual and physical realms were constantly intertwined and where divine or demonic intervention was a go-to explanation for unusual events. Strange noises in a church were increasingly likely to be attributed to structural issues or natural phenomena, not tormented souls or angry saints. The framework for interpreting the world changed, and stories that relied on that older framework started to sound less like signs from God or the devil, and more like, superstitions. This gradual shift didn't mean faith disappeared, obviously, but the kind of phenomena people reported or believed in started to evolve. The focus might shift more to visions, stigmata, or miraculous healings that could be attributed directly to divine power, rather than spooky, potentially unsettling noises from a box of bones. Screaming relics felt a bit too close to folk magic or outright creepiness for an age trying to reconcile faith with new scientific understandings. A quirky tidbit here is that while the belief in screaming relics might have faded from mainstream religious discourse, the idea of inanimate objects holding some kind of unsettling, perhaps tormented energy didn't entirely vanish. It migrated into Gothic literature, ghost stories, and later horror tropes. The haunted object, the cursed artifact, these modern concepts owe a little something to the medieval notion that things connected to powerful forces, even holy ones, could sometimes behave in ways that defied simple explanation and felt wrong. So while St. Bartholomew's screaming arm bone might not keep you up at night anymore, the idea of a doll's eyes following you across the room certainly might. Thanks, Chucky. You're just a secularized screaming relic, aren't you? Another factor in their fading prominence might simply be changing pilgrimage routes and popular shrines. As new saints emerged, new miracles were reported, and the geopolitical landscape shifted, some older shrines might have become less popular, and the specific legends associated with them faded from collective memory or became regional folklore rather than widely disseminated accounts. So how do these stories resonate today? Honestly, probably not much for most people. They're a historical footnote, a curiosity for people interested in medieval history, folklore, or the weirder edges of religious belief. They pop up in academic papers or perhaps in fictional works drawing on medieval settings. They don't have the widespread recognition of, say, the Shroud of Turin or the Holy Grail. They're too specific, too strange, maybe too unsettling for modern religious sensibilities. We like our relics quiet and miraculous, not screaming in existential agony or demonic torment. For the historian, they offer a fascinating window into the medieval mind and the complex relationship between faith, perception, and narrative. They challenge us to think about what constituted proof or evidence in a pre-scientific age. How did people verify these claims? What was the social function of such stories? Did they reinforce faith by demonstrating the relic's power? Or did they introduce an element of fear and uncertainty? Historians still argue whether these reports represent genuine, albeit misunderstood, physical phenomena, collective psychological events, deliberate fabrications, or simply the natural consequence of interpreting ambiguous sounds through a deeply supernatural worldview. It's an open debate, unlikely to be definitively settled without a time machine and some very sensitive recording equipment. The enduring mystery, then, isn't really if the stories existed. They clearly did. The mystery is what was happening that led to them. Was it wind? Was it trickery? Was it something only perceptible to medieval ears conditioned by intense belief? We're left peering back through the centuries, trying to understand a world where the veil between the seen and the unseen felt incredibly thin, where a box containing a saint's finger bone could conceivably cry out. These stories, as bizarre as they seem, highlight the power of belief to shape perception. If you genuinely believe that holy objects can interact with the spiritual realm, if you expect signs and wonders, or signs and horrors, then ambiguous sensory input is likely to be interpreted through that lens. A creak becomes a groan, a whistle becomes a wail, a strange echo becomes a scream from the sacred. Your mind, steeped in the stories you've heard and the faith you hold, provides the meaning. It's a testament to the human capacity for pattern recognition, for finding narrative even in random noise, especially when emotions and expectations are high. And perhaps that's the true legacy of the screaming relics. Not as proof of actual auditory saintly distress, but as a vivid illustration of how culture, belief, and psychology intertwine to create shared experiences and enduring narratives, even ones that seem utterly baffling to us today. They remind us that history is not just about grand events and famous names, but also about the strange, sometimes creepy, things that ordinary people believed, feared, and reported experiencing in their everyday lives, or in this case, on their extraordinary journeys of faith. They remain a whisper from a distant past, a faint echo in the historical record, a bizarre footnote that reminds you just how different the world felt less than 1,000 years ago. A world where even holiness could, paradoxically, manifest as a terrifying sound in the dark confines of a medieval church. A thought to chew on as you settle down. Now dim the lights even further. Let your shoulders relax. Maybe give a little stretch. The long journey into the past, through dusty chapels and across miles of rough medieval roads, is coming to a close. We've wandered through beliefs that seem strange to us now, heard whispers of wonders and horrors associated with objects held most sacred. Let those images gently fade away, like the last embers of a fire. There's nothing left to puzzle over tonight, just the quiet of your own space. Breathe in slowly and out. Feel the weight of the day lift, the historical curiosities recede into the background. Your mind is free to rest now, leaving behind the pilgrims, the relics, and the echoing sounds of centuries past. Just calm. Let your thoughts drift away like clouds, light and unburdened. The stories are told, the journey complete. All is quiet, peaceful. Time to let sleep take hold.